The Missing Bride of Rosewood Village. Chapter 1. The Wedding at Hawthorne Hall. The cottages were well kept. The church bell sounded reliably every Sunday, and disagreements, when they occurred, were generally confined to questions of garden boundaries or the proper arrangement of flowers for the harvest festival. By the summer of 1955, the village was preparing for what many regarded as the most important social event in years. Miss Celia Ashcombe was to be married. The wedding had been discussed for months. One could scarcely purchase a loaf of bread, visit the post office, or attend a church committee meeting without hearing some mention of flowers, dresses, seating arrangements, or guest lists. Celia was 26 years old and generally admired throughout the district. She possessed dark hair, intelligent eyes, and a calm manner that encouraged confidence in others. Her fiancé, Richard Fenton, had arrived in Rosewood 2 years earlier. He had purchased a small estate just outside the village after returning from service overseas, and had quickly established himself as a respectable member of local society. The match seemed ideal, at least that was the opinion most frequently expressed. Not everyone agreed. "Too perfect," Mrs. Pritchard remarked one morning while selecting apples at the village grocer's. "Nothing wrong with perfection," replied Mrs. Baines. "There usually is," said Mrs. Pritchard. Such observations circulated quietly, though few paid them much attention. The wedding itself was to take place at St. Luke's Church, followed by a reception at Hawthorne Hall, the Ashcombe family residence. The hall stood on a gentle rise overlooking fields and woodland. Built of pale stone and surrounded by extensive gardens, it represented the nearest thing Rosewood possessed to a grand country house. On the morning of the wedding, sunlight illuminated every window. Gardeners moved among carefully arranged roses. Tables had been positioned beneath white canopies. Servants hurried through corridors carrying trays and decorations. Everything appeared precisely as it should. Yet several individuals later remembered experiencing a vague sense of unease. Not fear, not suspicion, merely the feeling that something stood slightly out of place. Miss Jane Marple arrived shortly before 11 o'clock. She had been invited through a distant connection with the Ashcombe family and was staying nearby with an old friend. To most guests, she appeared exactly what she seemed, a pleasant elderly lady with knitting in her handbag and a talent for polite conversation. Few people looked at Miss Marple twice. This suited her perfectly. She spent several minutes observing arrivals from a shaded bench near the garden entrance. People revealed a great deal when they believed nobody was paying attention. A young maid dropped a tray and immediately burst into tears. A footman reassured her. A local businessman checked his watch no fewer than 7 times within 10 minutes. An elderly aunt repeatedly examined the guest list, despite already knowing everyone expected to attend. Such small behaviours interested Miss Marple enormously. Human nature was wonderfully consistent. Around noon, guests began taking their seats within the church. The organist played softly. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows. The atmosphere carried all the familiar excitement associated with weddings. Richard Fenton stood near the altar. He appeared handsome and composed. Several women remarked upon his confidence. Others noted that he seemed unusually pale. The distinction would later become significant. At 12:15, the first indication of trouble appeared. The bride had not arrived. At first, nobody worried. Minor delays were common. A misplaced veil, a torn glove, a forgotten bouquet. Such matters occurred frequently. The vicar continued chatting with guests. The organist repeated several selections. Richard glanced toward the entrance. 5 more minutes passed. Then 10. Whispers began. The bride's mother left her seat and disappeared through a side door. Her expression remained controlled, though not entirely successful. The groom checked his watch. Someone laughed nervously. The church felt subtly altered. By 12:30, Concern had become visible. Guests exchanged uncertain looks. Conversations grew quieter. The bride's father, Harold Ashcombe, entered through the rear of the church and approached the groom. A brief conversation followed. Neither man appeared pleased. Richard's face tightened. Harold looked genuinely bewildered. Miss Marple observed both men carefully. Confusion could be imitated. Bewilderment rarely could. Another 10 minutes passed. Finally, Harold Ashcombe stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, attempting a smile, "there appears to be a small delay. We would be grateful for your patience." The announcement failed to reassure anyone. Guests began speculating immediately. Perhaps Celia had become ill. Perhaps her car had broken down. Perhaps... The possibilities multiplied rapidly. Mrs. Pritchard later admitted that she had developed 14 separate theories before the next half hour ended. At 1 o'clock, the wedding was formally postponed. No explanation was offered. Guests were invited to proceed to Hawthorne Hall, while family members attempted to locate the bride. The mood of celebration dissolved completely. Clusters of people gathered throughout the gardens. Rumours spread with astonishing speed. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea and found a seat beneath a cedar tree. From there she watched the unfolding drama. A surprising number of people seemed less concerned for Celia's safety than eager to discuss potential scandals. Human beings, she reflected, often preferred exciting explanations to sensible ones. By 1:30, a search party had been organised. Several local men began examining roads and footpaths. Others checked nearby farms. The village constable, Mr. Graves, arrived shortly afterward. Though competent enough in ordinary circumstances, he appeared uncertain how to handle a missing bride. The matter might still prove innocent. Young women occasionally changed their minds. Not often at the altar, but occasionally. At 2 o'clock, an unexpected development occurred. A gardener named Albert Finch approached Harold Ashcombe carrying a small object. The conversation that followed immediately attracted attention. Within moments, several family members gathered around. Voices rose. Faces paled. Miss Marple remained seated. Experience had taught her that important information frequently travelled toward observers without any effort on their part. Sure enough, Mrs. Baines hurried over several minutes later. "Terrible news," she whispered. "What has happened?" asked Miss Marple. "They've found something belonging to Celia." "Indeed." "A glove." Miss Marple nodded. "A wedding glove. Where was it found?" "In the rose maze." The elderly lady stirred her tea thoughtfully. The rose maze occupied a secluded corner of Hawthorne Hall's grounds. Visitors often became lost there despite its modest size. Children adored it. Adults tolerated it. Very few people visited it on busy occasions. "Only the glove?" asked Miss Marple. Mrs. Baines leaned closer. "They also found her bouquet." That was more interesting. A single glove might be misplaced. A bouquet was another matter entirely. The afternoon search expanded. By 3 o'clock, nearly every accessible corner of the estate had been examined. No trace of Celia appeared. Her room contained her personal belongings. Her wedding dress was gone. No luggage seemed missing. No note had been found. The situation became increasingly puzzling. Richard Fenton spent much of the afternoon answering questions. His responses remained calm, perhaps too calm. Several observers remarked upon it. Others defended him. People reacted differently to shock. Miss Marple knew this perfectly well. She also knew that excessively controlled emotions often deserved careful attention. As evening approached, dark clouds gathered above the surrounding countryside. The celebration tents stood abandoned. Half-eaten cakes remained untouched. Musicians had long since departed. Rosewood Village found itself confronting a mystery unlike any it had experienced in living memory. At 7 o'clock, the police from the nearest town arrived. The matter had clearly become more serious than a simple disappearance. Inspector Lionel Hargreaves assumed responsibility for the investigation. A practical man in his early 40s, he listened carefully to initial reports before requesting interviews with family members and wedding guests. The difficulty lay in determining which. Night settled over Hawthorne Hall. Search lanterns moved across lawns and pathways. Voices echoed faintly through gardens. Inside the house, worried relatives gathered in drawing rooms and corridors. Miss Marple sat quietly near a window. Her knitting rested untouched. Something about the situation troubled her, not the disappearance itself. Human beings vanished for countless reasons. No, what interested her was a peculiar inconsistency, a very small inconsistency, one that nobody else seemed to have noticed. She recalled Richard Fenton standing at the altar. She remembered his expression, his posture, his reaction when informed of the delay. Then she remembered something else, a remark she had overheard barely an hour before the ceremony. A trivial observation, the sort of detail most people forgot immediately. Yet Miss Marple had never believed in trivial details. People often dismissed them because they failed to understand their importance. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across distant hills. Within Hawthorne Hall, anxiety deepened, and somewhere, hidden beneath layers of respectability, old resentments and carefully buried secrets were beginning to stir, had vanished without a trace. But Miss Marple suspected that before long, someone would make a mistake, and when that happened, the truth would begin to emerge. Rain drummed steadily against the windows of Hawthorne Hall, while search parties reluctantly abandoned the grounds. Lanterns had become nearly useless in the downpour. The bride seemed to have vanished from her own wedding day, as completely as a figure erased from a photograph. By morning, Rosewood Village was transformed. The disappearance dominated every conversation. At the bakery, customers spoke of nothing else. At the post office, letters were exchanged alongside theories. Even Reverend Collingwood found himself answering questions after morning prayers. People were hungry for explanations. In the absence of facts, imagination flourished. "She ran away," declared Mrs. Pritchard confidently. "Nonsense," replied Mrs. Baines. "Then where is she?" Mrs. Baines lowered her voice. "I think somebody took her." This possibility produced immediate silence. Until that moment, many villagers had preferred the romantic notion of a runaway bride. The alternative was considerably darker. Meanwhile, Inspector Hargreaves established a temporary headquarters inside Hawthorne Hall's library. Maps covered a large table. Witness statements accumulated steadily. Constables moved in and out carrying notes and reports. Yet despite considerable effort, the investigation yielded remarkably little. The bride had been seen entering her dressing room shortly before 11. Several maids had helped prepare her gown. At approximately 11:30, she had apparently left the room alone. After that, certainty vanished. Different witnesses offered contradictory accounts. One gardener believed he had seen her near the rose maze. A maid thought she heard footsteps on the rear staircase. A delivery driver claimed he noticed someone in white crossing the grounds. None of these observations could be verified. The timeline remained frustratingly incomplete. Inspector Hargreaves disliked incomplete timelines. They tended to conceal important things. Late that morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to the hall. No one questioned her presence. Elderly ladies often visited families during times of distress. The fact that Miss Marple happened to possess an unusually sharp mind remained largely unnoticed. She found Mrs. Ashcombe seated in a small drawing room overlooking the gardens. The missing bride's mother looked exhausted. Her eyes showed evidence of a sleepless night. Miss Marple settled into a nearby chair. "My dear Mrs. Ashcombe," she said gently, "this must be a dreadful ordeal." The woman nodded. "I cannot understand it." "No?" Celia was happy. The certainty in her voice caught Miss Marple's attention. Many parents claimed to know their children thoroughly. Few actually did. "You are quite sure?" asked Miss Marple. Mrs. Ashcombe hesitated, only briefly. Yet Miss Marple noticed. "Well," she admitted, "as sure as any mother can be." There it was. A tiny adjustment. A small retreat from certainty. Miss Marple stored it away. Had she expressed any doubts about the marriage? No. The answer came quickly, too quickly. Again, Miss Marple remained silent. People often filled silence with useful information. Mrs. Ashcombe sighed. There were occasional disagreements between Celia and Mr. Fenton. Nothing serious. What sort of disagreements? The woman looked uncomfortable. Ordinary things. Miss Marple smiled kindly. In her experience, people frequently described extraordinary matters as ordinary, particularly when they wished to avoid discussing them. The conversation drifted elsewhere. Yet several minutes later, Mrs. Ashcombe unexpectedly volunteered another piece of information. "Richard can be rather determined. Indeed, he likes matters arranged his way." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. There was nothing inherently suspicious about determination. Nevertheless, she had observed many tragedies born from excessive certainty. After leaving the drawing room, she wandered into the gardens. The storm had washed everything clean. Roses glistened with rainwater. Gravel paths shone beneath the morning sun. Several constables continued examining the grounds. Their attention focused primarily upon the rose maze. The glove and bouquet had been found there. Consequently, everyone assumed the maze held significance. Miss Marple was not entirely convinced. People often concentrated on where something was discovered, rather than how it arrived there. The distinction mattered. She approached the maze entrance. Tall hedges formed twisting passages through carefully maintained rose bushes. The air carried the scent of wet flowers. Inspector Hargreaves appeared nearby, studying footprints preserved in a muddy section of path. He greeted her politely. "Good morning, Miss Marple." "Inspector, enjoying our little puzzle?" The remark was intended humorously. Miss Marple smiled. Mysteries are rarely enjoyable for those directly involved. "Quite true." The inspector straightened. "What do you make of it?" "I scarcely know enough to form an opinion." This was technically accurate. She knew far too little to reach conclusions. What she possessed were impressions, and impressions could be dangerous if trusted prematurely. The inspector gestured toward the maze. "Our best lead remains this area." "Because of the bouquet? And the glove?" "Of course." They walked together. Several constables searched methodically among rose bushes. Nothing else had been found. No signs of violence, no torn fabric, no blood, no indication that Celia had come to harm. The absence itself seemed peculiar. Miss Marple paused beside a stone bench. A cluster of pink roses grew nearby. Something caught her eye. Not a clue exactly, merely a detail. She leaned closer. One rose branch had been broken recently. The damage appeared fresh. Inspector Hargreaves noticed her interest. Something there? Perhaps nothing. The inspector examined the branch. Could have happened during the search. Certainly. Yet Miss Marple wasn't entirely persuaded. The break occurred higher than expected, almost at shoulder height. Someone moving quickly might have brushed against it, or perhaps not. The difficulty with small clues was determining whether they were clues at all. As they continued through the maze, they encountered Richard Fenton. The groom appeared composed, impressively composed. His dark suit remained immaculate despite recent events. He greeted them courteously. "Inspector, Mr. Fenton." For several moments they discussed search efforts. Richard listened attentively, asked sensible questions, expressed appropriate concern. Everything about his behavior appeared reasonable. And yet, Miss Marple found herself remembering a village woman she had once known. The woman had possessed a remarkable ability to cry precisely when expected. Never too much, never too little. The performance had been flawless, until it eventually collapsed. Human beings rarely managed perfection for long. Richard turned toward Miss Marple. A terrible business. Very much so. I only hope Celia is safe. Again, the words sounded correct, but something about them lingered unpleasantly. Not what he said, how he said it, as though repeating a statement rehearsed internally many times. The conversation ended shortly afterward. Richard departed toward the hall. Inspector Hargreaves watched him leave. "What do you think of him?" Miss Marple asked casually. The inspector shrugged. "Too early to say. A sensible position. He has no obvious motive." Miss Marple said nothing. Motives often remained hidden until the very end. The afternoon brought another development. A maid named Elsie Turner requested a private meeting with the inspector. The interview lasted nearly 40 minutes. News of it spread rapidly. By evening, speculation consumed the village once again. Finally, details emerged. Elsie claimed she had overheard an argument 2 nights before the wedding. The participants had been Celia and an unidentified man. The conversation occurred near a summer house on the Ashcombe grounds. According to Elsie, Celia sounded distressed. The man sounded angry. Most importantly, the maid believed she heard the words, "You cannot tell him." The statement immediately generated excitement. Tell him what? The question dominated discussion throughout Rosewood. Inspector Hargreaves, however, remained cautious. Witness memories often improved dramatically after newspapers became involved. Nevertheless, the revelation introduced a new possibility: secrets. Every village possessed them. Rosewood was no exception. That evening, Miss Marple sat beside a fire in her friend's cottage. Rain tapped softly against the windows once more. A pot of tea rested nearby. She reviewed the facts carefully. A missing bride, a seemingly ideal engagement, an overheard argument, a bouquet abandoned in the rose maze. None of it formed a coherent picture, yet certain elements felt strangely familiar. Not the events themselves, human nature beneath them. That was what mattered. People lied for predictable reasons. They concealed things in predictable ways, and when frightened, they often revealed far more than intended. Miss Marple recalled another detail, a very small one. During the wedding preparations, one of the maids had mentioned that Celia rarely removed a particular silver locket. It had belonged to her grandmother. She wore it almost constantly. Yet according to witness statements, the locket had not been found among her belongings, nor had anyone clearly remembered seeing it on the wedding morning. An insignificant matter, perhaps. Or perhaps not. Miss Marple set down her teacup. Outside, darkness settled over Rosewood Village. Somewhere, someone knew exactly what had happened to Celia Ashcombe, and that person was becoming increasingly nervous. Because secrets could be maintained only so long, sooner or later, a careless word, a forgotten detail, or a moment of panic would expose the truth. And when that happened, Miss Marple intended to be listening. Milk carts rattled along familiar roads. Yet beneath this appearance of ordinary existence lay a constant current of speculation. Every conversation eventually returned to the same subject: Celia Ashcombe, the missing bride. The mystery seemed to grow larger with every passing day. Inspector Lionel Hargreaves disliked mysteries that grew larger. He preferred them to shrink. Each interview, each clue, each new piece of evidence ought to narrow possibilities. Instead, the disappearance appeared to be expanding. The more he learned, the less certain he became. This irritated him considerably. At Hawthorne Hall, the atmosphere had become increasingly strained. Family members who had once spoken freely now measured their words. Servants exchanged nervous glances. Visitors arrived offering sympathy while quietly gathering information. The hall itself seemed altered. The abandoned wedding decorations remained in place. awaiting decisions nobody wished to make. Wilted flowers hung from archways. Unused tables stood beneath damp canvas tents. The celebration had become a monument to unanswered questions. That morning, Inspector Hargreaves returned to interview Elsie Turner. The young maid sat nervously in the library. She twisted a handkerchief between her fingers while the inspector reviewed his notes. "You are certain about what you heard?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "And the voice belonged to Miss Ashcombe?" "I believe so." "Believe?" Elsie swallowed. "Well, I didn't actually see her." The inspector's expression darkened slightly. Witnesses frequently became less confident when questioned a second time. "Then how do you know it was Miss Ashcombe?" "The voice sounded like hers." "Sounded?" The maid's certainty weakened further. "I suppose it could have been someone else." Inspector Hargreaves resisted the urge to sigh. The dramatic revelation that had excited the village was becoming less reliable by the minute. "Tell me exactly what happened." Elsie described the evening once again. She had been returning from the kitchen gardens shortly after dusk. As she passed near the summer house, she heard raised voices. One belonged to a woman, the other belonged to a man. The conversation was largely unintelligible. Only fragments reached her. The words, "You cannot tell him," remained the clearest memory. What did the man sound like? Angry. "Can you describe his voice?" Elsie hesitated. "Not really." The inspector closed his notebook. The interview had produced little of value, yet something continued troubling him. The statement itself. "You cannot tell him." It suggested the existence of a secret, and secrets were often connected to crimes. Meanwhile, Miss Marple pursued her own inquiries. Her methods differed considerably from official police procedure. She preferred conversations over interrogations, tea over confrontation. People frequently revealed more when they felt comfortable. That morning she visited Mrs. Florence Granger. The elderly widow occupied a cottage directly overlooking the lane leading to Hawthorne Hall. More importantly, Mrs. Granger possessed an extraordinary talent for observation. From her sitting-room window, very little escaped notice. After exchanging pleasantries, Miss Marple gently guided the discussion toward recent events. Mrs. Granger responded enthusiastically, "I hardly slept for 2 nights after it happened. I can imagine. And such strange things have been occurring." Miss Marple looked interested. "Strange things?" Mrs. Granger leaned forward. "I saw someone leaving the hall very late the night before the wedding." "That was interesting." "Indeed?" "A gentleman." "What time?" "Nearly midnight." Miss Marple remained perfectly calm. Internally, however, her attention sharpened considerably. "Did you recognize him?" "I did." Mrs. Granger paused dramatically. "It was Dr. Malcolm Reeves." The doctor's name was already familiar. He had served Rosewood Village for nearly 15 years. A respected physician in his late 30s, he enjoyed a reputation for professionalism and discretion. The revelation seemed surprising. "Are you certain?" asked Miss Marple. "Absolutely." "What was unusual about his visit?" Mrs. Granger lowered her voice. "He wasn't using the front entrance. That changed matters considerably. Where did he leave from?" "The side garden gate." Miss Marple considered this carefully. A doctor visiting a patient late at night was not remarkable. A doctor leaving secretly through a garden gate was another matter entirely. "Did anyone accompany him?" "No." "And he appeared hurried?" Mrs. Granger nodded firmly. "Very hurried." Afterward, Miss Marple thanked her hostess and departed. As she walked through the village, she reflected upon the information. Perhaps it meant nothing. Then again, perhaps it explained something important. Human beings rarely used side gates when they wished to avoid attention. The doctor's surgery occupied a red brick building near the village green. Miss Marple arrived shortly before noon. The waiting room contained 3 patients and a sleeping spaniel. Dr. Malcolm Reeves emerged moments later. He greeted her warmly. "Miss Marple, What a pleasant surprise. The doctor possessed an intelligent face and a calm demeanour. His manner inspired confidence. Many people trusted him completely. Miss Marple had learned that trust and innocence were not always identical. After a brief medical consultation regarding a minor complaint, which Miss Marple cheerfully invented, they settled into casual conversation. Eventually, she mentioned the wedding. A shadow crossed the doctor's face. Terrible business. Quite. I cannot imagine what became of the poor girl. The response seemed sincere. Yet Miss Marple noticed something else. Fatigue. The man looked exhausted. More exhausted than circumstances alone might explain. You knew Miss Ashcombe well, reasonably well. The answer came carefully, too carefully. She was one of your patients. Among many others. Miss Marple nodded. Then she waited. Silence once again performed its useful work. After several seconds, the doctor spoke. I understand the police have been asking questions. That is their duty. Naturally. His fingers tightened slightly around a pencil. A tiny movement, almost invisible. Miss Marple saw it nonetheless. People frequently betrayed emotions through their hands. The conversation ended politely. Yet, as she departed, she felt increasingly convinced that Dr. Reeves was concealing something. The question remained whether that secret related to Celia's disappearance. Elsewhere, Inspector Hargreaves had made a discovery of his own. A search of Celia's bedroom revealed a locked writing desk. The key was eventually located among her belongings. Inside, investigators found letters, dozens of them. Most were entirely innocent. Correspondence with friends, household matters, wedding arrangements. But one bundle immediately attracted attention. The letters had been tied together with a blue ribbon. They were older than the others, and none had been written by Richard Fenton. Inspector Hargreaves spent the afternoon reading them carefully. The author was never identified directly. The letters were signed only with the initial M. Their contents were affectionate, occasionally romantic. In several places, references suggested a close emotional attachment. One sentence particularly interested the inspector. There are things I wish I could tell the world, but some truths bring only pain. The line seemed oddly significant. Who was M? A former suitor? A friend? Something else entirely? The discovery immediately complicated the investigation. By evening, rumours concerning a secret romance spread through Rosewood with astonishing speed. Most of them were wildly inaccurate. Some were positively imaginative. Yet one consequence proved unavoidable. Attention shifted away from Richard Fenton. For the first time, villagers began considering the possibility that someone from Celia's past had returned. That night, another storm threatened. Dark clouds gathered above the countryside. A strong wind swept through the gardens of Hawthorne Hall. Inside the library, Harold Ashcombe sat alone reviewing old family papers. He appeared 10 years older than he had a week earlier. The strain was beginning to show. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Richard Fenton entered. The two men exchanged polite greetings. For several moments neither spoke. Then Richard closed the door. "I've been meaning to ask you something." Harold looked up. "What is it?" Richard hesitated. The pause seemed unusual, almost reluctant. "Did Celia ever mention a man named Martin?" Harold frowned. "Martin? Yes. No." Richard nodded slowly. A strange expression crossed his face. Disappointment, perhaps, or concern. The older man could not decide. "Why do you ask?" "Just something I heard." The answer sounded unsatisfactory. Harold noticed. So did Richard. For a moment the room became uncomfortably quiet. Then Richard smiled. The smile appeared natural, yet something about it felt forced. A mask adjusted slightly out of position. The conversation ended soon afterward. Neither man felt entirely reassured. Later that night, Miss Marple sat beside her bedroom window, watching rain begin to fall across the village. The letters troubled her. not because of what they revealed, because of what they failed to reveal. The writer remained hidden, the relationship remained unclear, and yet something about the entire matter felt wrong, artificial, as though the letters had been discovered at exactly the moment someone wished them to be discovered. She recalled a woman from St. Mary Mead many years earlier. That woman had once planted evidence against herself. The idea sounded absurd, yet it had worked brilliantly. People tended to trust obvious clues, especially when those clues appeared unexpectedly. Miss Marple closed her eyes thoughtfully. Somewhere in the darkness, pieces of the puzzle were beginning to shift. Someone had lied, possibly several people. Someone was protecting a secret, and somewhere within those secrets lay the explanation for Celia Ashcombe's disappearance. The question was no longer whether the truth would emerge. The question was, who would be harmed when it did? For before dawn arrived, another event was already moving silently toward Rosewood Village. An event that would change the entire investigation. And this time, there would be no doubt that a crime had occurred. Thomas Wren, a fisherman who rented a small stretch of riverbank beyond Hawthorne Hall, had risen before dawn as usual. He was a practical man with little interest in village gossip, and throughout the week he had largely ignored the growing excitement surrounding Celia Ashcombe's disappearance. That changed when he noticed something unusual near the old boathouse. At first glance, it appeared to be little more than a dark shape partially concealed among reeds and driftwood. Then he moved closer. A moment later, he turned sharply and hurried back toward the village. By 7 o'clock, Inspector Hargreaves stood beside the river. Several constables had secured the area. A crowd was already gathering despite repeated instructions to remain away. Human curiosity rarely obeyed police orders. The body belonged to a man, not Celia. The realization produced immediate confusion. Many villagers had expected the worst regarding the missing bride. Nobody had anticipated finding someone else. The dead man appeared to be approximately 40 years old, well-dressed, respectably groomed, a stranger, at least initially. Inspector Hargreaves crouched beside the body. The man's face showed signs of prolonged exposure to water, yet something immediately struck him as odd. The river where the body had been found was shallow, far too shallow to explain everything. Dr. Malcolm Reeves arrived shortly afterward. After conducting a preliminary examination, he delivered an unexpected opinion. "I don't believe he drowned." The inspector looked up. "No?" The doctor shook his head. "There are indications he was already dead before entering the water. That altered matters considerably." The disappearance of a bride had become a murder investigation. Within an hour, identification arrived. The dead man was Martin Hale. The name spread through Rosewood Village with astonishing speed. By mid-morning, nearly everyone knew it. By noon, nobody seemed entirely certain who Martin Hale actually was. Opinions varied dramatically. Some claimed he was a businessman from London. Others insisted he had military connections. One particularly imaginative theory suggested he was an international criminal. The truth proved considerably less dramatic. Martin Hale had once lived in a neighbouring county. He worked as a surveyor, and, according to documents found among his possessions, he had arrived in Rosewood only 3 days before the wedding. That detail immediately attracted Inspector Hargreaves' attention. 3 days, not 3 months, not 3 weeks, 3 days. The timing seemed unlikely to be coincidental. Meanwhile, news of the discovery reached Hawthorne Hall. Harold Ashcombe received the information in stunned silence. His wife appeared horrified. Richard Fenton reacted differently. He became very still, so still that several people noticed, only briefly. Then the expression vanished. Yet Miss Marple happened to witness it, and she stored the observation away carefully. The human face often revealed truths before the mind regained control. Later that morning, the inspector began interviewing anyone who might possess information about Martin Hale. The results proved frustrating. Nobody in Rosewood admitted knowing him. Several villagers thought they had seen him. None were certain. His presence remained strangely disconnected from the community, until a surprising revelation emerged. The owner of the village inn recognized his photograph. "Yes," said Mr. Jarvis. "He stayed here." Inspector Hargreaves leaned forward. "When, 2 nights before the wedding, under his own name, Martin Hale." This was the first solid lead in days. What was he like? The innkeeper considered. Quiet. Anything else? He seemed nervous. The answer immediately interested the inspector. Nervous how? Like a man expecting trouble. Mr. Jarvis paused. Kept watching the door. That afternoon the investigation took another unexpected turn. A chambermaid from the inn came forward voluntarily. She remembered something unusual. On the evening before his death, Martin Hale had received a visitor. A woman. The maid had not seen her face clearly, only her clothing. She wore a blue coat. The description seemed hopelessly vague. Half the women in the county owned blue coats. Yet one detail followed. The coat had silver buttons. Inspector Hargreaves wrote this down. Silver buttons were more distinctive. Not much, but enough. The meeting had apparently lasted nearly an hour. Voices were heard, not raised, not angry, simply serious. When the woman departed, Martin Hale appeared agitated. Several guests noticed. Unfortunately, nobody knew the woman's identity. As news spread, speculation exploded once again. Rosewood Village became a factory producing theories. Every resident seemed determined to solve the mystery personally. By evening, the number of suspected killers had exceeded practical limits. Miss Marple spent much of the day listening. Listening was often more valuable than questioning. People revealed remarkable things while discussing others. During tea at Mrs. Granger's cottage, she heard no fewer than 6 contradictory accounts regarding Martin Hale. 5 were clearly nonsense. The 6th interested her. It came from a retired railway clerk named Arthur Bell. "I saw him speaking with Miss Ashcombe." Several heads turned immediately. When? Monday afternoon. That would have been only days before the wedding. "Where?" asked Mrs. Granger. "Near the churchyard." Arthur Bell adjusted his spectacles. They appeared to know one another. The room fell silent. At last, a direct connection between Martin Hale and the missing bride. Miss Marple asked a question. Did Miss Ashcombe seem pleased to see him? The old clerk frowned. No. That answer mattered. How did she seem? Arthur thought carefully. Upset. The conversation ended there. Yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly intrigued. Martin Hale arrives 3 days before the wedding. He meets Celia privately. Days later, Celia vanishes. Then Martin Hale is found dead. The pattern could no longer be ignored. That evening, Inspector Hargreaves assembled the principal facts. The board in the library contained a growing collection of notes: missing bride, dead stranger, secret letters, unknown argument, possible hidden relationship. Yet the pieces refused to fit together. He stared at the board for several minutes. Something important remained missing, something central. Without it, the entire puzzle made no sense. A knock interrupted his thoughts. One of his constables entered. "We found something, sir." The inspector looked up. "What is it?" "A notebook." "Whose?" "Martin Hale's." The notebook had been recovered from a locked suitcase at the inn. Most entries concerned travel and work, ordinary matters, routine observations. Then investigators discovered several pages devoted exclusively to Rosewood Village, and one name appeared repeatedly: Celia Ashcombe. The inspector's pulse quickened. At last, something concrete. He began reading immediately. The earliest entries described attempts to locate her. Subsequent pages mentioned meetings, conversations, questions. Yet the most startling note appeared only days before Martin's death. Written in hurried handwriting, it stated, "She still doesn't know everything. Someone has lied to her for years." Inspector Hargreaves read the sentence twice, then a third time. Someone has lied to her for years. About what? And who? The note offered no explanation, only mystery. But mystery of a new kind, not romance, not jealousy, something older, something buried, a long-standing deception. Elsewhere, Miss Marple sat quietly beside a fire. The notebook information had already reached her through channels she never fully explained. She reflected upon the sentence thoughtfully. Someone has lied to her for years. The wording felt important. Not mistaken, not misled. Lied. Deliberate deception. Her thoughts drifted toward Harold Ashcombe, toward Mrs. Ashcombe, toward old family histories. Families possessed remarkable talent for preserving secrets, sometimes for generations. Outside, rain clouds drifted across the moonlit countryside. Inside Hawthorne Hall, another secret was preparing to emerge. Because hidden among old papers, forgotten letters, and carefully guarded memories lay a truth someone had spent many years protecting. A truth Martin Hale had apparently discovered, and perhaps died because of. Meanwhile, the missing bride remained unseen. No sign of Celia had been found. No message had arrived. No witness had come forward. It was as though she had stepped out of the world entirely. Yet Miss Marple did not believe that. People rarely vanished without leaving traces. The traces were there. The difficulty lay in recognizing them. And before another day passed, a small object would be discovered inside Hawthorne Hall, an object so ordinary that most people would overlook it. But to Miss Marple, it would become the first truly significant clue in the entire case. Not discovered through dramatic investigation, it was found by a maid dusting a bookshelf. Miss Marple often remarked that important truths preferred commonplace hiding places. People expected mysteries to arrive with fanfare. In reality, they usually appeared while someone was carrying laundry or sweeping a corridor. On Friday morning, Elsie Turner was cleaning the small morning room at Hawthorne Hall. The room had seen little use during recent days. Most members of the household remained occupied with police interviews, visitors, and endless discussions regarding the disappearance. Consequently, several areas of the house had been neglected. Elsie was dusting the lower shelves of a bookcase when she noticed something glimmering behind a row of gardening manuals. Curious, she reached inside. A moment later, she withdrew a silver locket. The maid recognized it immediately. Nearly everyone in the household did. It belonged to Celia. Within an hour, Inspector Hargreaves stood examining the object. The locket was oval-shaped, slightly worn, and attached to a delicate silver chain. Mrs. Ashcombe identified it without hesitation. "She's worn it since childhood." The inspector opened it carefully. Inside were 2 miniature photographs. One depicted Celia as a little girl. The second photograph produced immediate surprise. The man pictured was unfamiliar to nearly everyone present. "Who is he?" asked the inspector. Mrs. Ashcombe looked puzzled. "I don't know." Harold Ashcombe studied the image. "No idea." The inspector frowned. That seemed strange. If the photograph occupied half of a cherished childhood locket, one might expect her parents to recognize it. Yet neither did. Miss Marple, who happened to be present, remained silent. She observed faces instead of photographs. Sometimes reactions mattered more than evidence. Mrs. Ashcombe genuinely appeared confused. Harold Ashcombe appeared something else. Not confusion, recognition, only for a fraction of a second. Then it vanished. Most people missed it entirely. Miss Marple did not. The discovery prompted another round of interviews. Unfortunately, nobody could identify the man. The photograph appeared old, perhaps 20 years old, perhaps more. The mystery deepened. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple requested permission to examine the locket herself. Inspector Hargreaves agreed readily. He had already learned that dismissing Miss Marple's observations was rarely wise. She carried the locket to a sunny window. For several minutes she studied it carefully. Then she noticed something. A tiny inscription engraved along the inner edge. The lettering was so small it could easily escape attention. Miss Marple retrieved her spectacles. The inscription read, "To see. Always yours, A." She repeated the words quietly. "Always yours, A." Interesting. Very interesting. The initial was not M, not Martin. A. Another person entirely. When she informed the inspector, his expression grew thoughtful. "So now we have an A as well." "It would appear so." The inspector rubbed his forehead. "I am beginning to suspect half the alphabet is involved." Miss Marple smiled. Human affairs often appeared complicated until one discovered the correct thread. Then everything unravelled surprisingly quickly. The difficulty lay in finding the thread. That evening brought another significant development. A solicitor from a nearby town contacted the police. His name was Leonard Bryce. He claimed to possess information concerning Martin Hale. Inspector Hargreaves arranged an immediate meeting. The solicitor arrived shortly before dusk, a serious man with silver hair and impeccable manners. He appeared reluctant to discuss the matter. Nevertheless, circumstances left him little choice. "I knew Martin Hale professionally," he explained. "In what capacity?" "I handled certain legal matters." The inspector nodded. "Related to Miss Ashcombe?" A brief hesitation followed, indirectly. The answer immediately attracted attention. "Explain." Mr. Bryce removed his spectacles. For several moments he stared at them thoughtfully. Then he spoke. "Approximately 8 months ago, Martin Hale began researching a private family matter." "What family?" "The Ashcombes." Silence settled across the room. Inspector Hargreaves leaned forward. Miss Marple remained perfectly still. The solicitor continued. He believed there was a discrepancy involving an old birth record. The words seemed oddly insignificant, yet everyone present sensed their importance. "A birth record? Yes. Whose?" The solicitor hesitated. "I don't know." The answer sounded genuine. "He never told me." "Why not?" "Because he was uncertain." The inspector frowned. "Uncertain of what?" The solicitor answered quietly. "Whether his suspicions were correct." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Miss Marple asked a question. "What caused him to investigate in the first place?" The solicitor looked surprised. It was precisely the right question. "A letter." "From whom?" "I don't know." Again uncertainty. Again frustration. Yet the information mattered. A mysterious letter. An old birth record. The Ashcombe family. The puzzle was slowly changing shape. After the solicitor departed, Inspector Hargreaves reviewed everything carefully. A disturbing possibility emerged. Suppose Martin Hale had discovered something significant about the Ashcombe family. Suppose he brought that information to Rosewood. Suppose Celia learned the truth. What might happen then? The answer depended entirely upon the nature of the secret. Meanwhile, Rosewood Village continued generating rumours at impressive speed. Several residents now believed Celia had secretly married another man. Others insisted she had fled the country. One particularly imaginative theory involved foreign spies. Miss Marple ignored all of them. Gossip occasionally contained useful fragments. The conclusions rarely did. Instead, she spent the evening examining older village records. Her search focused upon a period approximately 26 years earlier, the year of Celia's birth. She visited the parish archives shortly before closing time. Reverend Collingwood assisted politely. Within an hour, several dusty ledgers covered the table before her. Births, deaths, marriages, routine entries stretching back decades. Most contained nothing remarkable. Then Miss Marple noticed a familiar surname. Ashcombe. Her eyes narrowed. The entry itself appeared ordinary, yet something about the dates struck her as peculiar, very peculiar. She checked another record, then another. Gradually, a pattern emerged, a pattern that produced more questions than answers. By the time she left the church, darkness had fallen. The village streets stood nearly empty. A cool wind rustled through hedgerows. Miss Marple walked slowly, thinking. The records suggested one possibility. Only a possibility. Nothing more. Yet if correct, it would explain several otherwise puzzling details. Martin Hale's investigation, the mysterious birth record, the unknown photograph, even the strange note in Martin's notebook. Someone has lied to her for years. The words returned once again. Suddenly they felt far less mysterious. At Hawthorne Hall, another drama was unfolding. Richard Fenton had requested a private conversation with Harold Ashcombe. The two men met in the study after dinner. The discussion began calmly. It did not remain calm. Voices rose. Accusations followed. A servant passing outside overheard fragments. Should have told me. Trying to protect her. Too late now. The conversation ended abruptly when they realized someone might be listening. Yet the damage was done. Word spread quickly. By midnight, half the village believed Harold Ashcombe and Richard Fenton were concealing something. For once, the village gossip happened to be correct, because both men were hiding secrets. The difference was that neither knew the full truth, and neither realized how close Miss Marple had come to uncovering it. As she prepared for bed that night, she removed a folded note from her handbag. It contained several dates copied from the parish records. She read them once more, then she smiled faintly. Not triumphantly, simply thoughtfully. The dates did not prove anything, but they suggested a direction, and directions were valuable, especially when wandering through a maze of deception. Outside, the church clock struck midnight. Far away, unseen by anyone in Rosewood, a lone figure stepped from a train onto a dimly lit platform. The traveller carried a small leather case. Inside the case rested documents, old documents, dangerous documents. And by the following evening, those documents would arrive in Rosewood Village. When they did, the carefully protected history of the Ashcombe family would begin to crack open. And someone, realizing the truth was drawing near, would make a desperate mistake. Chapter 6. The Stranger with the Leather Case. Saturday dawned beneath low grey clouds. The weather seemed determined to mirror the mood of Rosewood Village. 5 days had passed since Celia Ashcombe disappeared. 3 days since Martin Hale's body had been discovered beneath the boathouse. Yet despite countless interviews, searches and theories, the central mystery remained stubbornly unsolved. If anything, it had become more complicated. Inspector Lionel Hargreaves arrived at Hawthorne Hall shortly after 9 o'clock, carrying a growing sense of frustration. The investigation now contained too many questions and too few answers. He disliked that ratio. The hall itself felt increasingly strained. Everyone appeared tired. Servants moved quietly through corridors. Family members spoke in subdued voices. Visitors arrived less frequently than before, as though uncertainty itself had become contagious. Harold Ashcombe spent much of his time in the study. His wife rarely left her room. Richard Fenton alternated between restless activity and long periods of silence. The entire household seemed suspended in anticipation of something not yet understood. Around 11 o'clock, the anticipated visitor finally arrived. He came by train from London. A thin man in his 60s with neatly combed white hair and a serious expression. His name was Edgar Morton. The leather case remained clasped tightly in one hand. Inspector Hargreaves met him personally. The visitor introduced himself politely. "I understand you're investigating the death of Martin Hale." "That's correct." "And the disappearance of Miss Celia Ashcombe." "Also correct." Morton nodded. "I'm afraid I possess information relevant to both matters." The inspector immediately escorted him to the library. Within minutes, Miss Marple was invited to attend as well. She accepted without hesitation. The old gentleman placed his leather case carefully upon the table. For several moments he appeared reluctant to open it. Then, with visible effort, he released the clasps. Inside rested a collection of documents, letters, certificates, photographs, several aging legal records. The sort of papers people preserved for decades because they mattered deeply. Inspector Hargreaves leaned forward. "What exactly are these?" The answer came quietly. "Evidence." Miss Marple watched him closely. Mr. Morton seemed troubled, not frightened, not guilty, troubled, as though he regretted the necessity of his task. "Evidence of what?" asked the inspector. The old man folded his hands. "A deception that began 26 years ago." Silence filled the room. Even before hearing the details, Miss Marple felt certain she had approached the same conclusion herself. The dates, the parish records, the peculiar inconsistencies, all of them pointed towards something hidden in the distant past. Mr. Morton removed a birth certificate. "This concerns a child born in October of 1929. Inspector Hargreaves glanced at the document. The name immediately attracted attention. Not Celia Ashcombe, another name entirely, a female infant registered in a neighbouring county. "What does this have to do with Miss Ashcombe?" he asked. Morton hesitated, then answered, "Everything." The room became very quiet. The old man continued. "Martin Hale discovered these records 8 months ago." "How?" "He was conducting genealogical research for a private client." Miss Marple nodded slightly. Such investigations often uncovered unexpected matters. Families left trails. Some trails led directly toward secrets. Martin noticed discrepancies, such as names appearing where they shouldn't. The explanation sounded vague, yet it gradually became clearer. Several records appeared connected through unusual circumstances. A birth, a death, a guardianship arrangement, none remarkable individually. Together, however, they suggested something extraordinary. Finally, Inspector Hargreaves asked the obvious question. "What did Martin Hale believe?" Mr. Morton removed his spectacles. His voice softened. He believed Celia Ashcombe was not Harold and Margaret Ashcombe's biological daughter. The words settled over the room like falling dust. Nobody spoke immediately. The revelation seemed almost absurd. Yet the documents suggested otherwise. Miss Marple remained calm. She had anticipated something similar. Not certainty, but possibility. The parish records had pointed unmistakably in that direction. The inspector examined the papers carefully. They raised her from infancy. Yes. And never told her? Apparently not. Another silence followed. This one longer than the first. The implications were enormous. Martin Hale's note suddenly acquired new meaning. Someone has lied to her for years. Not a romantic deception, not blackmail, a concealed identity, an entire life built upon an omission. The inspector leaned back. "Did Martin prove it?" Morton nodded. "Privately? How?" The old man hesitated again, then reached into the case. This time he produced photographs. One showed a young woman. The resemblance struck everyone immediately. She looked remarkably like Celia. Not identical, but unmistakably related. The same eyes, the same expression, the same shape of face. "Who is she?" asked Hargreaves. "Her birth mother." The room fell silent once more. For a brief moment, even the inspector seemed uncertain what to say. The mystery had suddenly shifted, not solved, shifted. The foundation beneath everything was changing. Miss Marple studied the photograph carefully. Then she asked a question nobody else considered. "Did Martin tell Celia?" Morton looked surprised. Again, it was the question that mattered most. Yes. The answer altered everything. When? 3 days before the wedding. Inspector Hargreaves sat upright. The timing was explosive. 3 days before the wedding, exactly when Martin Hale arrived in Rosewood, exactly when witnesses observed meetings between him and Celia, exactly when the arguments reportedly occurred. Suddenly the entire sequence made sense, at least partially. Martin had not come seeking romance. He had come seeking truth, truth that could destroy lives. The inspector spoke slowly. So Martin tells Celia she was adopted, essentially, and 2 days later she disappears. Yes. And then Martin is murdered. Again the answer came. Yes. Nobody needed to state the obvious conclusion. The connection had become impossible to ignore. Yet Miss Marple remained unsatisfied. Something still felt incomplete. The revelation explained Celia's distress. It explained the meetings. It explained the note. But it did not explain murder. People concealed family secrets. They argued about them. They rarely killed for them, not usually. There had to be more, much more. The afternoon brought further questioning. Harold Ashcombe was confronted with the documents. The effect proved dramatic. The older man appeared utterly defeated. Years seemed to settle upon his shoulders all at once. Eventually he confessed. Most of the story, at least. Celia had indeed been adopted as an infant. The arrangement had been private, legal, and known only to a small handful of people. "We loved her," he said quietly. "No one doubts that," replied the inspector. The old man closed his eyes. "We intended to tell her." "When?" Harold could not answer, because the truth was obvious. They had never intended to tell her. Not really. Years had passed, then more years. Eventually the secret became easier to maintain than reveal. A common human failing. Miss Marple had observed it many times. People postponed difficult conversations until the opportunity vanished forever. By evening, Rosewood Village was buzzing with fresh rumors. The revelation spread rapidly despite police efforts. Shock gave way to fascination. The disappearance now seemed linked to a hidden family history. Yet the murder remained unsolved, and Celia remained missing. Those facts mattered more than gossip. As darkness approached, Miss Marple sat alone in the hall's conservatory. Rain tapped gently against glass panels overhead. Her thoughts drifted through the evidence. Martin Hale discovers a secret. He tells Celia. She becomes upset. An argument follows. Then she vanishes. Later, Martin is murdered. Simple. Too simple. The pattern felt constructed, almost convenient, like a stage performance directing attention toward one conclusion. Miss Marple disliked convenient conclusions. They frequently concealed inconvenient truths. A faint reflection caught her eye. Someone was approaching through the corridor. Richard Fenton. The groom paused upon seeing her. For a moment he appeared uncertain whether to continue. Then he entered. "Miss Marple." "Mr. Fenton." He sat opposite her. The silence lingered. Finally he spoke. "Did you know?" "About the adoption?" "Yes." "No." Richard stared through the rain-streaked glass. When he spoke again, his voice sounded strangely tired. "Celia told me." Miss Marple looked at him carefully. "When?" "The day before the wedding." "Interesting. Very interesting. And how did you react?" A shadow crossed his face. "Not well." At last, a truthful answer. The first entirely truthful answer she had heard from him. "I was angry, because she hadn't told you sooner." Richard nodded, then shook his head, then laughed bitterly. "I don't even know anymore." The reaction struck Miss Marple as genuine. For the first time, the carefully controlled groom seemed to crack, just slightly, enough to reveal something human beneath. Yet as their conversation continued, another thought emerged, a troubling one. Richard knew the secret before the wedding. Martin knew. Celia knew. Harold knew. Margaret knew. That was a great many people. Far too many for a secret that had survived 26 years. Secrets became dangerous when they spread, and dangerous secrets sometimes produce desperate actions. As Richard departed, Miss Marple's gaze lingered upon the rain outside. Something important remained hidden. She could feel it. The adoption explained the beginning of the story, not the end. The real motive still waited somewhere in the shadows. And before Sunday arrived, a discovery inside Martin Hale's hotel room would expose a clue so alarming that Inspector Hargreaves would finally abandon his belief that the murder and disappearance were separate crimes. Because someone had overlooked a single piece of paper, a piece of paper that should never have existed, and upon it was written a name that changed everything. Chapter 7. The Name on the Torn Page. Sunday morning arrived with clear skies for the first time in nearly a week. The sunshine should have brought relief. Instead, it seemed almost inappropriate. Rosewood Village remained trapped beneath the shadow of unanswered questions. The church bells rang as usual. Villagers gathered for morning service. Children played in the lanes. Yet beneath every ordinary activity lingered the same unspoken thought. Where was Celia Ashcombe? And who had killed Martin Hale? Inspector Lionel Hargreaves attended neither church nor breakfast. He had been summoned to the Rosewood Arms shortly after dawn. The proprietor had discovered something unexpected while preparing Martin Hale's room for a more thorough police search. At first glance, the item appeared insignificant. A torn piece of paper, nothing more. It had slipped behind the back panel of a writing desk and remained unnoticed during previous inspections. The inspector examined it carefully. The fragment measured only a few inches across. Most of the original page was missing. Only a handful of words remained visible. Yet one detail immediately captured his attention. A name, written in Martin Hale's own handwriting. Dr. Malcolm Reeves. The inspector read it twice. Then a third time. The village doctor's name stood alone beside several incomplete notes. The remainder of the page had been torn away deliberately. Not accidentally. Someone had removed it. The question was why. By 10 o'clock, Inspector Hargreaves sat across from Dr. Reeves in the library at Hawthorne Hall. The doctor appeared calm, perhaps too calm. "You knew Martin Hale?" asked the inspector. "No." The answer arrived instantly. The inspector placed the torn page upon the table. For the first time, the doctor's expression changed, only slightly. "But enough. You've never met him." A pause followed. Then, "Not to my knowledge." The inspector leaned back. "Your name appears among his private notes." Dr. Reeves studied the paper. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded unusually careful. "I cannot explain that." "No, no." Silence settled between them. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the window, observed the exchange with considerable interest. The doctor's discomfort seemed genuine, yet it differed from the discomfort of a guilty man. It resembled something else. Fear. Not fear of exposure, fear of consequences. A subtle distinction, but an important one. After nearly an hour of questioning, Dr. Reeves departed. The inspector remained dissatisfied. The interview had produced no direct evidence, yet suspicion now surrounded the doctor more heavily than before. Miss Marple waited until they were alone. "What do you think?" asked Hargreaves. The elderly lady folded her hands. "I think Dr. Reeves knows something." The inspector nodded. "So do I. But that is not necessarily the same thing as murder." The distinction irritated him, because it happened to be correct. The investigation possessed too many secrets, and too few crimes clearly connected to them. For the remainder of the morning, attention focused upon Martin Hale's recovered papers. Several pages appeared missing. Others contained references to meetings and conversations. Most were frustratingly vague, until a constable noticed something unusual. A sequence of initials, repeated several times. A.H. At first the notation seemed meaningless. Then another page surfaced, this one containing a sentence partially obscured by water damage. A.H. knows the truth. The inspector stared at the words. A.H. There were several possibilities, yet one stood above the others: Harold Ashcombe. The implication appeared obvious, too obvious. Miss Marple disliked obvious implications. Nevertheless, the discovery intensified pressure upon the Ashcombe family. Harold himself seemed exhausted by the constant scrutiny. When questioned about Martin Hale, he admitted only what was already known. Yes, he had met Martin. Yes, Martin revealed information concerning Celia's adoption. Yes, the conversation had been unpleasant. No, he added firmly, I did not kill him. The denial sounded sincere. Inspector Hargreaves believed him, at least regarding that specific question. Yet sincerity could be misleading. A person might tell the truth about one matter while concealing another. Human beings did it constantly. That afternoon, a more significant breakthrough emerged. One of Martin Hale's London associates arrived unexpectedly. His name was Charles Fenwick, a former colleague, a practical man with a remarkable memory. Upon learning of Martin's death, he had travelled immediately to Rosewood. His testimony proved invaluable. Martin wasn't investigating an adoption. The statement immediately startled everyone present. Inspector Hargreaves frowned. What do you mean? That wasn't his original objective. Then what was? Fenwick hesitated. The investigation began because of a death. The room became very still. What death? A woman named Alice Morton. Miss Marple's attention sharpened instantly. The name was unfamiliar, which made it important, Fenwick continued. Alice Morton died last year, and, before her death, she wrote a letter. Inspector Hargreaves felt a familiar frustration. Every answer seemed to produce 3 new questions. To whom? Martin. The man removed a folded document from his coat, a copy of the letter. The original remained elsewhere. The contents were brief, yet astonishing. The dying woman claimed she had witnessed an event many years earlier, an event connected to a child who had been taken from one family and raised by another. Not kidnapped, placed, deliberately. The distinction mattered. Yet one sentence stood out above all others. Someone powerful ensured the truth never emerged. The inspector lowered the letter slowly. Powerful. Within a village like Rosewood, power was a relative concept. Still, the suggestion changed everything. The adoption was no longer a private family arrangement. Now it carried hints of manipulation, concealment, influence. Miss Marple said very little during the discussion. She preferred listening, and what she heard disturbed her, not because the secret existed, because of its age. 26 years. An astonishingly long time for a deception to survive, unless multiple people had worked together. That evening, she visited the churchyard alone. The sun had begun sinking toward the horizon. Long shadows stretched across weathered gravestones. The quiet suited her thoughts. She walked slowly between rows of monuments until she reached a particular section. Several names from the parish records rested there. Names connected to the year 1929. Names most people had forgotten. Miss Marple had not. She stood before one grave longer than the others. A woman, died young, shortly after childbirth. The dates matched, perfectly. A coincidence? Perhaps. Yet she had spent her life observing human nature. Coincidences occurred, not usually in clusters. As she turned to leave, a voice interrupted her thoughts. Miss Marple. She looked up. Richard Fenton stood several yards away. He appeared troubled, more troubled than before. Good evening, Mr. Fenton. I need your advice. The request surprised her. Few suspects voluntarily sought advice from amateur detectives, though of course Richard was not necessarily a suspect, at least not yet. What sort of advice? He hesitated, then spoke quietly. If someone you loved lied to you, for years. The sentence remained unfinished. Miss Marple waited. Eventually he continued. Could you ever trust them again? A curious question. And revealing, she answered honestly. That depends upon the lie. Richard stared toward the fading sunlight. What if the lie wasn't theirs? Now that was far more interesting. Before she could respond, he shook his head. Never mind. Then he walked away, leaving Miss Marple with yet another puzzle. By the time darkness settled over Rosewood Village, the investigation had entered a new phase. The adoption secret was no longer the central mystery. Something larger surrounded it. Something older. Something that had frightened Martin Hale enough to document every step carefully. And someone had clearly attempted to destroy parts of those records. The torn page proved that much. Later that night, Inspector Hargreaves sat alone reviewing evidence. Photographs, statements, maps, letters. The collection seemed endless. As he reached for another file, something slipped free. A small envelope, previously overlooked. Recovered from Martin Hale's belongings. The seal had already been broken. Inside rested a single photograph. The inspector examined it under a lamp, then immediately sat upright. The image showed 4 people standing together outside a country house. The photograph was old, very old, yet one face was unmistakable, a much younger Harold Ashcombe. Another face belonged to a woman, perhaps 20 years old, beautiful, unfamiliar. The remaining 2 individuals were partially obscured. What captured the inspector's attention, however, was the handwritten note on the reverse. Only 6 words. Written by Martin Hale. Find the woman beside Harold. The inspector stared at the sentence. For the first time, he felt genuinely close to something important. Because if Martin Hale's final investigation centered upon that unknown woman, then perhaps she held the key to everything. The adoption, the deception, the murder, even Celia's disappearance. And somewhere beyond Rosewood, a person who believed the past had remained buried for 26 years was about to learn a dangerous truth. The past was beginning to fight its way back into the light. Chapter 8. The Woman in the Photograph. Monday morning began with a sense of urgency that had been absent from previous days. For the first time since the investigation began, Inspector Lionel Hargreaves felt he was pursuing something tangible. The photograph had changed matters. Photographs possessed an honesty that memories frequently lacked. People forgot conversations. They misremembered dates. They embroidered events. But a photograph captured a moment that had actually existed. The challenge lay in understanding what that moment meant. The inspector arrived at Hawthorne Hall shortly after breakfast carrying an enlarged copy of the image. Miss Marple was already there. She sat near a window with a cup of tea and appeared to be studying a gardening catalogue. The appearance was deceptive. Miss Marple rarely devoted her full attention to gardening catalogues when murder investigations were underway. "Good morning," said Hargreaves. "Inspector." He placed the photograph on a nearby table. "I intend to identify her." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. A worthy objective, the inspector pointed toward the young woman standing beside Harold Ashcombe. She appeared to be in her early 20s, dark-haired, elegant, remarkably attractive. The image had been taken approximately 27 years earlier, possibly 28. Yet there was something striking about her expression. Not happiness. Not quite. The woman looked as though she possessed a secret. "Any thoughts?" asked Hargreaves. Miss Marple studied the photograph. For several moments she remained silent. Then she said, "She appears very fond of Harold." The inspector blinked. "Fond?" "Yes." He stared at the image again. The observation seemed absurdly simple, yet once mentioned it became impossible to ignore. The young woman's gaze rested upon Harold rather than the camera. A small detail, but revealing. Miss Marple continued. "Whether Harold returned the sentiment is another question." The inspector frowned. Human relationships were becoming increasingly important to this investigation. Unfortunately, they were also considerably more complicated than fingerprints. Several claimed they did. Their suggestions proved wildly inaccurate. One elderly gentleman confidently identified her as a silent film actress who had died years before. Another insisted she was a distant cousin of the king. Neither theory survived serious examination. The breakthrough arrived shortly after noon. Mrs. Florence Granger requested a meeting. When shown the photograph, she gasped. "I know her." The room became instantly attentive. "Who is she?" asked the inspector. Her name was Evelyn Ward. The answer produced immediate silence. Mrs. Granger continued. "She lived here briefly when I was a girl." "You're certain?" "Quite certain." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "What happened to her?" The old woman frowned. "She left." "Why?" "I don't know." The answer came with genuine regret. "People stopped talking about her." Now that was interesting. Rosewood villagers rarely stopped talking about anything voluntarily. For a subject to vanish entirely from local conversation required effort, deliberate effort. Inspector Hargreaves arranged further inquiries immediately. By evening, additional pieces of Evelyn Ward's story emerged. She had arrived in Rosewood during the late 1920s. She worked for a charitable organization. She was well liked, and, according to several accounts, she spent considerable time in the company of Harold Ashcombe. The implication was obvious: a romance, perhaps even a serious one. Yet Harold eventually married Margaret Ashcombe, not Evelyn Ward. The question was why. That evening, the inspector confronted Harold directly. The older man appeared exhausted. Days of investigation had worn him down considerably. When shown the photograph, however, his reaction was unmistakable. Pain crossed his face, deep, immediate, uncontrolled. "Yes," he said quietly, "I knew her." The admission altered everything. The inspector waited. Harold stared at the photograph for several moments. Then he sighed. "We were engaged." The room fell silent. Miss Marple watched carefully. This was not the expression of a man remembering scandal. It was the expression of a man remembering loss. "What happened?" asked Hargreaves. Harold's voice softened. "She died." The answer surprised everyone. "She died?" "Yes." "When?" 1930. The date matched perfectly, almost too perfectly. The inspector frowned. "How?" Harold looked away. "Childbirth." Nobody spoke. Several pieces suddenly shifted into place. Not all, but enough. Miss Marple felt a familiar sensation, the feeling that a puzzle had begun revealing its shape. "She had a child?" asked the inspector. Harold nodded. "Yes." Another silence followed, longer this time. Then Hargreaves asked the obvious question. "What happened to the child?" Harold closed his eyes briefly. When he answered, his voice was barely audible. "I don't know." The statement hung in the air. Miss Marple immediately recognized it as the most important lie spoken all week. Not because Harold intended deception, because he wanted desperately to believe it himself. He knew. Perhaps not every detail, but he knew far more than he admitted. The interview ended soon afterward. Harold appeared genuinely distressed. Yet something remained concealed, something vital. Later that evening, Miss Marple walked through the gardens of Hawthorne Hall. The weather had improved considerably. Moonlight silvered the rose bushes. The maze stood silent, beautiful, deceptive, like many things connected to this case. Her thoughts returned repeatedly to Evelyn Ward. A young woman dies during childbirth. Her fiancé later marries another woman. A child vanishes from official records. 26 years pass. Then Martin Hale begins asking questions. No wonder someone became frightened. The question remained whether fear alone could explain murder. As she rounded a corner near the conservatory, she heard voices. Instinctively, she paused. The speakers occupied a terrace, partly concealed by climbing roses. One voice belonged to Richard Fenton. The other belonged to Dr. Malcolm Reeves. Their conversation sounded tense, not hostile, concerned. "Can't continue much longer," Richard was saying. "I know. You should have told them." The doctor answered immediately. "And what exactly would that accomplish?" Miss Marple remained perfectly still. Neither man realized she was nearby. Richard spoke again. "At least they would understand." "No," said the doctor quietly. "They would only suffer." A long silence followed. Then footsteps approached. Miss Marple retreated along another path before either man could see her. The exchange lasted less than a minute, yet it troubled her enormously, because it suggested something unexpected. Richard and Dr. Reeves shared a secret. Not necessarily a criminal secret, but a secret nonetheless. Another one. The case seemed determined to produce an endless supply of them. Meanwhile, Inspector Hargreaves continued examining Martin Hale's papers. Shortly before midnight, he made a discovery that left him staring at his desk in disbelief. One of Martin's notebooks contained a final entry written only hours before his death. The handwriting appeared hurried, uneven, as though composed under considerable strain. Most of the page contained abbreviations and incomplete thoughts. Only one sentence stood fully intact. The inspector read it slowly, then read it again. "Celia finally knows who her mother was." The statement alone would have been significant. The next line proved far more alarming. "She intends to meet him before the wedding." Him, not her, him. The word transformed everything. Because if Celia had learned the identity of her mother, then who was the man she intended to meet? Her father? Someone connected to Evelyn Ward? Someone who had hidden the truth for 26 years? Inspector Hargreaves felt a surge of excitement. At last, a new direction, a new suspect, a new possibility. Yet as he closed the notebook, another thought occurred to him. If Celia arranged such a meeting before the wedding, did it actually happen? And if it did, was that meeting the reason she vanished? Elsewhere, in a locked drawer inside a bedroom at Hawthorne Hall, lay an unopened envelope. Nobody had discovered it yet. Nobody even knew it existed. Inside rested a letter written by Celia herself. A letter composed on the night before her wedding. A letter containing a confession. And once that letter emerged, the investigation would move abruptly toward its most dangerous stage. Because for the first time, someone would realize that Celia Ashcombe had not disappeared by accident. She had been lured somewhere deliberately, by a person she trusted. Every answer generated fresh questions. The villagers now discussed the investigation with the confidence of people who believed they understood it. Unfortunately, no two explanations matched. Some insisted Harold Ashcombe was responsible. Others suspected Richard Fenton. A few favoured Dr. Malcolm Reeves. The more imaginative residents blamed all three simultaneously. Miss Marple listened politely whenever such theories reached her ears. Then she ignored them. Human beings preferred dramatic solutions. The truth was usually more complicated and far less convenient. At Hawthorne Hall, an unexpected discovery occurred shortly after breakfast. The event began with something entirely mundane. Mrs. Ashcombe decided to sort through several rooms that had remained untouched since the wedding preparations. The activity offered distraction, nothing more, at least initially. Accompanied by two maids, she worked methodically through cabinets, drawers, and writing desks. Near midday, attention turned toward a small bureau in Celia's sitting room. The bureau contained ordinary items, stationery, receipts, photographs, nothing remarkable. Then one of the maids discovered a locked compartment. The key was not immediately available. After some discussion, permission was granted to open it. Inside rested only 3 objects: a notebook, a photograph, and a sealed envelope. The envelope bore a single handwritten instruction, "For Mother and Father." Within an hour, Inspector Hargreaves sat in the library holding the letter. Miss Marple occupied a chair nearby. Harold and Margaret Ashcombe waited anxiously across the room. No one spoke. The silence felt almost ceremonial. At last, the inspector unfolded the letter. The handwriting belonged unmistakably to Celia. Her words filled several pages. The opening paragraphs concerned her parents. She expressed affection, gratitude, forgiveness. The contents immediately suggested she had already learned the truth about her adoption. Harold Ashcombe lowered his eyes. His wife quietly wept. Yet the truly important section appeared near the middle. The inspector read aloud, "I know who my mother was." Nobody moved. Martin showed me the documents. At first I refused to believe him. Then I saw the photographs. The room remained silent. "I do not blame you for raising me. I know you loved me, but I must learn the rest," the inspector continued. "There is one person who can answer the questions Martin cannot." Miss Marple's attention sharpened immediately. The sentence matched the notebook entry discovered the previous evening. "He has agreed to meet me." Again. He, the unidentified man, the mystery figure, the person Celia believed possessed the final answers. The inspector turned the page, then frowned. "What is it?" asked Harold. Hargreaves stared at the paper. "The final section is missing." The words fell heavily. The last page had been torn away. Deliberately. Only jagged edges remained. Whoever removed it had taken great care. Miss Marple studied the damaged paper thoughtfully. Not because of what was missing, because of when it had likely disappeared. The letter had been sealed, hidden, stored inside a locked compartment. That meant someone opened it after Celia vanished. Someone removed the final page. Someone feared its contents. That realization altered everything. Inspector Hargreaves reached the same conclusion moments later. Someone has tampered with this. No one disagreed. The question became obvious. Who? The answer remained elusive. The investigation intensified immediately. Every person with access to Hawthorne Hall became subject to renewed scrutiny. Servants, family members, visitors. Nobody escaped questioning. Yet no clear explanation emerged. By afternoon, another piece of evidence complicated matters further. The photograph discovered alongside the letter proved remarkable. It depicted Evelyn Ward, the same woman identified in Martin Hale's files. Yet she was not alone. Standing beside her was a man whose face had been carefully cut away. The photograph had been damaged years earlier, perhaps decades. Only Evelyn remained visible. Inspector Hargreaves examined the image repeatedly. The missing face frustrated him enormously. Someone had removed it intentionally, which suggested the identity mattered. A great deal. Meanwhile, Miss Marple devoted her attention elsewhere. She was less interested in photographs than behavior. Specifically, recent behavior. Several observations continued troubling her. Richard's conversation with Dr. Reeves, Harold's reaction to Evelyn Ward, the strange reluctance surrounding certain topics. Individually, none proved anything. Collectively, they formed a pattern centered upon protection. Not guilt, protection. Someone was trying desperately to shield another person. The distinction mattered. That evening she paid a visit to Dr. Reeves. The doctor's surgery had closed for the day. He appeared surprised by her arrival, yet he welcomed her politely. "Miss Marple, doctor," they settled in his office. For several minutes, conversation remained entirely ordinary. Village matters, weather, patients. Then Miss Marple changed direction. "You're protecting someone." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Dr. Reeves stared at her. For perhaps 3 seconds, he forgot to control his expression. That was enough. Miss Marple had her answer. Not the whole answer, but confirmation. The doctor sighed heavily. I cannot discuss this. Because of professional confidentiality? No. Interesting. Then why? The doctor's gaze drifted toward the window. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded tired. Because revealing certain truths would cause unnecessary pain. Miss Marple remained silent. Eventually he continued. You've probably concluded I'm hiding something. Yes, I am. Again, honesty, partial honesty, often the most revealing kind. But it has nothing to do with Martin Hale's death. Miss Marple studied him carefully. For the first time, she believed him completely. Not because of the words, because of the man. People who lied habitually became difficult to read. People burdened by secrets often became remarkably transparent. As she departed later that evening, her suspicions shifted subtly, away from Dr. Reeves, toward someone else, someone she had perhaps underestimated. At Hawthorne Hall, events were moving rapidly. Inspector Hargreaves had ordered a complete search of every room. The missing final page troubled him deeply. Evidence did not simply vanish. Someone had taken it. Someone connected to the case. Near 11 o'clock, one of the constables made a surprising discovery. Inside a waste bin recently emptied from a guest bedroom, investigators recovered fragments of burned paper. The material was badly damaged. Most of the text had been destroyed. Yet one phrase remained legible, only 3 words. Meet me at... The remainder had burned away. The inspector stared at the fragments. His pulse quickened. The message might have originated from the missing page, or from something else entirely. Either possibility mattered, because at last there was direct evidence of an arranged meeting. A meeting before the wedding. A meeting someone desperately wanted erased. Near midnight, Miss Marple sat alone in her room reviewing everything she knew. Celia discovers her adoption. Martin provides evidence. A mysterious man agrees to meet her. She vanishes. Martin dies. Someone removes evidence afterward. The sequence was becoming clearer. Yet one critical question remained unanswered. Who was the man? The answer hovered just beyond reach. She could almost feel it, like a forgotten name waiting to return. Then another memory surfaced, a small one, an insignificant detail from years ago. A case in St. Mary Mead, a woman searching for her biological father. Everyone focused upon the father. Nobody considered whether the woman already knew him. Miss Marple sat upright. A possibility emerged. Simple, dangerously simple. What if Celia's father had not been a stranger? What if he had been present in her life all along? The thought unsettled her enormously, because if true, it transformed the entire investigation. And if she was correct, someone else had probably reached the same conclusion years earlier. Someone with a very strong reason to keep the truth buried. Outside, the village slept peacefully. Inside Hawthorne Hall, however, a different drama was unfolding. A figure moved quietly through dark corridors, paused outside a locked study, then slipped inside. Minutes later, a drawer stood open. Documents were examined. One paper was removed. The intruder departed unseen. By morning, nobody would realize another piece of evidence had disappeared. But Miss Marple was already approaching the truth, and the closer she came, the more dangerous the situation became, because the person manipulating events since the beginning was growing desperate. And desperate people rarely make careful decisions. Chapter 10. Shadows in the Study. The following morning began with anger. Inspector Lionel Hargreaves was not a man who lost his temper easily. Years of police work had taught him patience. Yet patience had limits. The discovery that another document had vanished from Hawthorne Hall pushed him dangerously close to them. The missing paper had been part of a collection recovered from Martin Hale's belongings. Nothing dramatic, nothing obviously important, which, in the inspector's experience, often meant it was extremely important. Someone had entered the study during the night, someone familiar with the house, someone who knew exactly where to look. Most troubling of all, there were no signs of forced entry. The thief had moved confidently, comfortably, as though they belonged there. By breakfast, the household had become aware of the theft. The reaction varied considerably. Margaret Ashcombe appeared shocked. Harold Ashcombe seemed exhausted. Richard Fenton looked thoughtful. Dr. Malcolm Reeves looked worried. Miss Marple noticed every reaction. And one absence. Nobody appeared surprised. That interested her greatly. People confronted with unexpected events usually displayed surprise before any other emotion. The fact that nobody did suggested something significant. Perhaps they had all begun expecting further revelations, or perhaps they already knew more than they admitted. Inspector Hargreaves ordered fresh interviews. The prospect was not greeted enthusiastically. Nevertheless, everyone complied. The questioning produced little. Most answers sounded sincere. A few sounded rehearsed. None sounded useful. By midday, the investigation appeared stalled once again. Miss Marple disagreed. She believed it had reached its most important stage. Because people were no longer hiding facts. They were hiding relationships. And relationships almost always mattered more. That afternoon she paid another visit to the parish archives. Reverend Collingwood greeted her warmly. The elderly clergyman had become accustomed to her sudden appearances. "You found something?" he asked. "Possibly." "A clue?" Miss Marple smiled. "I prefer patterns." She spent several hours reviewing records. Old correspondence. Nothing dramatic. Yet slowly, another pattern emerged. Not involving Celia, not involving Martin, involving Dr. Malcolm Reeves. That surprised her. The doctor had steadily drifted away from her list of likely suspects. Yet his name continued appearing in unexpected places. Connected to people, connected to dates, connected to events, not criminal events, personal ones. The distinction was important. By late afternoon, Miss Marple possessed a theory, a delicate theory, one requiring confirmation. She left the church and walked directly toward the doctor's surgery. The village seemed unusually quiet. Clouds drifted lazily overhead. A warm breeze stirred the hedgerows. Ordinary beauty, extraordinary secrets. Such combinations occurred remarkably often. Dr. Reeves received her immediately. Perhaps he sensed resistance was becoming futile. They sat opposite one another. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Miss Marple asked, "Did you know Evelyn Ward?" The effect was instantaneous. The doctor's face lost colour. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough for confirmation. A long silence followed. Then he answered, "Yes." The truth had finally begun. Miss Marple remained patient. "How well?" The doctor stared at his hands. When he spoke again, his voice sounded distant. "Very well." Another silence. Then, "She was my mother." The words settled softly between them, yet their impact was enormous. Miss Marple had suspected something close to this. Still, hearing it aloud altered everything. Evelyn Ward, the young woman in the photograph, the woman who died after childbirth, and Malcolm Reeves was her son. For several moments neither spoke. Then Miss Marple asked the obvious question. Did Celia know? The doctor's answer came immediately. No, not yet. At least not officially. The implications unfolded rapidly. If Malcolm Reeves was Evelyn Ward's son, then he was connected directly to the hidden family history, connected to the adoption, connected to Martin Hale's investigation, connected to Celia. Yet something still felt wrong. The pieces did not fit comfortably. The doctor continued speaking, perhaps because years of silence had become unbearable. "My mother died when I was very young." "I see. I was raised by relatives." His expression hardened slightly. They preferred not to discuss the past. A familiar theme. Too familiar. The entire case seemed built upon conversations people refused to have. "What did Martin Hale discover?" asked Miss Marple. The doctor's gaze lowered. "He discovered that my mother gave birth twice." The room became silent. Miss Marple did not interrupt. She understood the significance immediately. Twice. Not once. Twice. Malcolm Reeves continued. "The first child was me. And the second?" The doctor's voice almost disappeared. "Celia." For several moments, neither moved. The revelation changed everything. Absolutely everything. The mystery no longer concerned an unrelated adoption. The connection was direct. Blood, family, history. Celia and Malcolm Reeves shared the same mother. Half-siblings, separated by circumstance, raised in entirely different lives. Neither fully aware of the truth. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. At last, several impossible details suddenly made sense. Martin Hale's obsession, the hidden records, the secrecy, even the doctor's strange behavior. He had not been protecting himself. He had been protecting Celia. The distinction was enormous. Yet one crucial question remained. If Evelyn Ward was Celia's mother, Miss Marple spoke carefully. Who was her father? The doctor's expression changed. There it was. The question everyone had been circling. The question hidden beneath every clue. The question someone might kill to conceal. For several seconds, Malcolm Reeves said nothing. Then, "I don't know." This time, Miss Marple believed he was lying. Not maliciously, protectively, but lying nonetheless. The interview ended shortly afterward. The doctor had revealed enough, perhaps more than he intended. As Miss Marple walked home, her thoughts raced. 2 children, 1 mother, different fathers perhaps, or perhaps not. Either possibility carried enormous consequences. And suddenly Richard Fenton's strange question returned to her memory. What if the lie wasn't theirs? Such an odd way of phrasing it. Unless Richard had already learned something personal, something devastating. Meanwhile, Inspector Hargreaves experienced a breakthrough of his own. A forensic examination, limited though such methods were in 1955, revealed traces of ash embedded within Martin Hale's coat. Not ordinary ash. Burned paper. A considerable quantity. The finding immediately interested him. Martin had destroyed documents shortly before his death, or witnessed someone else destroying them. Either explanation mattered. The inspector ordered another search of Martin's hotel room. This time, attention focused upon the fireplace. Hours later, a constable discovered something remarkable. A partially burned envelope trapped behind a loose brick. Most of it had been destroyed. One section survived. Enough to reveal a single line. Only one. Yet it was enough. The truth about her father must never become public. Inspector Hargreaves stared at the sentence, then read it again. Her father. Not her mother. Not the adoption. The father. At last, the investigation had identified its true center. The entire mystery revolved around a man. An unnamed man. A hidden father. Someone important enough to inspire decades of secrecy. Someone important enough to terrify Martin Hale. Someone important enough that evidence kept disappearing. The inspector immediately sent for Miss Marple. She arrived shortly before evening. After reading the surviving line, she remained silent for nearly a minute. The inspector waited. Finally he asked, "What are you thinking?" Miss Marple folded the paper carefully. "I'm thinking," she said quietly, "that we've been asking the wrong question." The inspector frowned. "What question?" "Not who killed Martin Hale. That's rather important, certainly." She looked toward the darkening windows. "But first we must understand why." The inspector considered this, then nodded reluctantly. "Motive. Always motive. Without it, everything else remained incomplete. Miss Marple continued. Someone believed the identity of Celia's father was worth protecting. Agreed. Enough to conceal it for 26 years. Yes. And perhaps, she paused, enough to commit murder. Outside, evening settled across Rosewood Village. Lights appeared one by one behind cottage windows. The village looked peaceful, safe, ordinary. Yet beneath that calm surface, the truth was finally beginning to emerge, and Miss Marple now suspected something even more shocking than murder. She suspected that the missing bride had discovered her father's identity before she vanished. Not afterward, before, which meant she had gone to meet him knowing exactly who he was. And if that were true, then the man at the center of the mystery was not hiding in the past. He was still very much present in Rosewood Village, watching, waiting, and growing increasingly frightened, because Miss Marple had finally begun looking in the right direction. Chapter 11. A Daughter's Discovery. The curiosity was obvious. Every new revelation generated another wave of speculation. The fear was quieter. And despite the village's determination to treat the matter as an intriguing mystery, reality was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Someone among them was dangerous. Inspector Lionel Hargreaves felt that truth more strongly than ever. For nearly a week, he had pursued clues through a maze of secrets and half-truths. Now, for the first time, he believed he could see the outline of the truth. Unfortunately, outlines were not enough. He needed certainty, and certainty remained frustratingly elusive. Meanwhile, Miss Marple spent the morning doing something that appeared entirely unrelated to the case. She visited the village tea rooms. There she drank tea, ate a modest slice of seed cake, and listened. Listening had always been one of her most effective investigative tools. People tended to underestimate quiet, elderly women. This remained one of humanity's most useful weaknesses. Near the window sat 3 elderly residents discussing recent developments. Most of their conversation contained nothing valuable. Then one remark caught Miss Marple's attention. It came from a retired schoolmistress named Edith Longley. "Funny thing," Edith said. "What is?" asked her companion. "That old cottage near Briar Wood." Miss Marple's attention sharpened immediately. The cottage stood several miles beyond the village boundary, rarely occupied, frequently forgotten. "What about it?" asked Mrs. Pritchard. Edith stirred her tea. "I saw lights there last week." The statement seemed insignificant, until she added, 2 nights before the wedding. Miss Marple set down her cup, very carefully. The timing interested her enormously. Later that afternoon she arranged transportation and visited the cottage personally. The building stood alone near a stretch of woodland, weathered stone walls, a neglected garden, shuttered windows, no sign of recent habitation, at least not immediately. The property appeared abandoned. Appearances, however, often lied. Miss Marple examined the area slowly, patiently. Several details attracted her attention. Footprints had long since vanished. Rain had seen to that. Yet other traces remained. A recently repaired gate, a fresh tire mark near the lane. Most importantly, evidence that someone had occupied the cottage within the past fortnight. A teacup, matches, a folded newspaper. Nothing dramatic, yet sufficient. Someone had been here. The question was who? As she explored the garden, another discovery followed. Near a side path stood a small wooden bench. Beneath it, partially concealed by weeds, lay a torn scrap of paper. Most of the writing had faded. Only a few words remained legible. Yet they were enough. Thursday, 8 o'clock. Miss Marple stared at the fragment. Thursday, the day before the wedding. The day Martin Hale's notebook suggested Celia planned to meet someone. A coincidence? Perhaps. But she doubted it. That evening she shared her findings with Inspector Hargreaves. The inspector listened carefully, then rubbed his forehead. The cottage may have been the meeting place, possibly. If so, someone cleaned it thoroughly. Not thoroughly enough. The inspector smiled despite himself. Miss Marple possessed a remarkable talent for finding things others missed. The following morning brought another breakthrough. One of the constables investigating Martin Hale's movements located a taxi driver from a nearby town. The driver remembered transporting a young woman on the evening before the wedding. His description matched Celia. The destination? The cottage near Briar Wood. Inspector Hargreaves immediately sat upright. Confirmation. Celia had gone there. The missing bride had indeed attended a secret meeting, and now they knew where. "What happened afterward?" he asked. The driver shook his head. "I left. Did you see anyone else?" "A man." The room became very still. "What man?" The driver frowned. "I couldn't identify him." "Why not?" It was dark. The answer frustrated everyone. Yet he provided one useful detail. The man had arrived before Celia. He was already waiting. A planned meeting, not a chance encounter. Exactly as Martin's notes suggested. The inspector spent the remainder of the day reconstructing timelines. Gradually, a clearer picture emerged. Thursday evening. Celia travels to Briarwood Cottage. An unidentified man waits there. A conversation occurs. Afterward, Celia returns home, at least temporarily. Then Martin Hale dies the following day, and the wedding never takes place. The sequence felt increasingly significant, yet one question overshadowed all others. Who was the man? Late that afternoon, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor, Richard Fenton. The groom appeared exhausted. Weeks seemed to have aged him. He accepted tea but barely touched it. For several moments neither spoke. Then Richard produced a folded piece of paper. "I should have shown this to the police earlier." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Should you?" "Yes." The answer came without hesitation. That alone interested her. People who truly regretted concealment often became remarkably direct. Richard handed her the document. It was a note, written by Celia. Brief, personal, and extremely revealing. Miss Marple read it carefully. "Richard, if what Martin told me is true, I must know everything before we marry. Please don't be angry. I need answers, and there is someone who can give them." The letter continued. "I believe he has wanted to tell me for years." Miss Marple read the sentence twice, then a third time. Wanted to tell me for years. Not feared telling her. Wanted to tell her. The wording mattered greatly. Richard watched her silently. Finally he spoke. I think she knew who he was. Miss Marple looked up. Why? Because she wasn't frightened. The observation was excellent. People meeting strangers for dangerous revelations often expressed anxiety. Celia apparently had not. She seemed determined, perhaps even hopeful. The distinction changed everything. After Richard departed, Miss Marple spent several hours reviewing every known fact. One detail refused to leave her thoughts. Celia believed the man wanted to tell her, not threaten her, not manipulate her, tell her. That implied affection, concern, possibly guilt. The possibilities narrowed considerably. Then, just before sunset, another piece finally slid into place. A memory. A comment. Something Harold Ashcombe had said days earlier. So small she had nearly forgotten it. Yet now it returned with startling clarity. When discussing Evelyn Ward, Harold never described her as a mistake, never as a scandal, never as an embarrassment, only as a tragedy. The distinction mattered, because people generally concealed shame. This felt different. This felt like sorrow. Miss Marple suddenly understood something. Not the entire mystery, but enough. Enough to identify the next question. And the next question led directly toward Dr. Malcolm Reeves. That evening she visited him once more. The doctor appeared unsurprised, almost resigned. I wondered when you'd return. Miss Marple sat opposite him. Doctor, Miss Marple. The silence lingered. Then she spoke. Who was Evelyn Ward in love with? For the first time since the investigation began, Malcolm Reeves looked genuinely alarmed. Not frightened, heartbroken. There was a difference. The doctor lowered his eyes. When he answered, his voice barely rose above a whisper. Harold Ashcombe. The truth had finally emerged, or part of it. Miss Marple remained perfectly still. Harold was Celia's father. The doctor nodded. Once. Only once. Yet that single movement altered the entire case. At last everything made sense. The adoption, the secrecy, the hidden records, the decades of silence. Harold Ashcombe had not merely adopted Celia, he had raised his own daughter, the daughter of the woman he once loved, a daughter whose existence had been concealed after tragedy struck, a daughter who never knew the truth, until Martin Hale arrived. Miss Marple felt no triumph, only sadness. The entire situation carried the weight of wasted years, lost opportunities, unspoken truths. Yet one enormous question remained. If Harold was Celia's father, why had Martin Hale been murdered? The revelation explained the secret, not the crime. Dr. Reeves seemed to understand her thoughts, because he spoke before she asked. Harold didn't kill Martin. Miss Marple believed him. Immediately, completely. Harold possessed many flaws. Murder was not among them, which left a more troubling possibility. Someone else had learned the truth. Someone else had feared its consequences. Someone willing to kill. Outside, darkness settled over Rosewood Village. The mystery had finally exposed its hidden heart. Celia discovered her true father. She arranged a meeting. The meeting occurred. The truth emerged. Yet afterward, something went terribly wrong. Because the next day, Martin Hale died, and Celia disappeared. Miss Marple now stood closer to the solution than ever before, close enough to recognize one final deception, a deception hidden in plain sight from the very beginning, a deception involving not who Celia met, but what happened after she met him. And before another 24 hours passed, a witness would finally come forward, a witness who had remained silent out of fear, a witness who had seen someone leaving Briarwood Cottage that night. Someone nobody expected. Someone whose presence would transform the entire investigation and bring Miss Marple face to face with the murderer. Chapter 12. The Witness at Briarwood. Thursday morning arrived with an unusual stillness. The kind of stillness that often precedes storms. Not storms of weather, storms of truth. Miss Marple sensed it the moment she awoke. The investigation had reached a delicate point. The major secret had finally emerged. Harold Ashcombe was Celia's biological father. The adoption had been a carefully maintained deception, stretching across 26 years. Yet despite the significance of that revelation, Miss Marple remained convinced it was not the motive for murder. People lied. People concealed family scandals. People protected reputations. Such behavior was regrettably common. Murder required something more, something sharper, something desperate. And somewhere within the tangled history of Rosewood Village, that desperation still waited to be uncovered. Shortly after breakfast, Inspector Hargreaves received a visitor. The woman arrived hesitantly, as though uncertain whether she wished to be there at all. Her name was Martha Bell. She lived on a small farm near Briarwood. The inspector recognized her immediately. A quiet widow, reliable, not prone to exaggeration. The moment she entered his office, he sensed she possessed something important. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Bell?" The woman clasped her hands tightly. "I think I saw something." The inspector sat forward. "When?" "The night before the wedding." The room became very still. Miss Marple happened to be present and remained silent. Martha continued. "I didn't come sooner because I wasn't certain." "What did you see?" The widow swallowed. A car. The answer seemed disappointing, until she elaborated. It was parked near the old cottage. Inspector Hargreaves felt his pulse quicken. The cottage at Briar Wood. The location of Celia's secret meeting. What time? About 9:30. That was important. Very important. According to existing timelines, Celia had arrived around 8 o'clock. A meeting lasting an hour would place events precisely within that period. "Did you see anyone?" Martha hesitated, then nodded. "A man." The inspector's pencil paused above his notebook. "Who?" The widow lowered her voice. "I believe it was Richard Fenton." Silence followed. A profound silence. Richard. The groom. The man everyone had largely stopped suspecting. Inspector Hargreaves exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. Neither spoke immediately. Finally he asked, "You're certain?" "No." The answer came honestly. "I saw him from a distance." "Then why mention his name?" "Because of the coat." The explanation sounded weak, yet not entirely worthless. Richard owned a distinctive dark overcoat rarely seen elsewhere in the village. Several witnesses had commented upon it previously. Still, clothing was not evidence. Merely possibility. After Mrs. Bell departed, the inspector stared thoughtfully at his notes. "Well?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Interesting." "You don't sound surprised." "No." "Should I be concerned by that?" "Probably." The answer did little to improve his mood. By midday, Richard Fenton was summoned once again. The interview proved revealing, not because of what he admitted, because of what he failed to deny. "Did you visit Briarwood Cottage that night?" asked Hargreaves. Richard remained silent for several moments. Then, "Yes." The admission stunned the inspector. "Why?" Richard looked exhausted. "I followed her." Now it was Miss Marple's turn to speak. "You followed Celia?" "Yes." His expression hardened slightly. "She refused to tell me where she was going." The explanation sounded plausible, painfully plausible. A man engaged to be married discovers his fiancée is keeping secrets. He follows her. Human nature supplied countless examples. "What happened?" asked the inspector. Richard looked away. "I saw her meet someone." The room became perfectly still. "Who?" Richard hesitated, then answered, "Harold Ashcombe." The words landed heavily, not because they were surprising, because they confirmed what Miss Marple had already begun to suspect. Celia's secret meeting had been with her father, her real father, Harold. The inspector frowned. "What happened next?" Richard shook his head. "I left." The answer arrived too quickly. Miss Marple noticed. So did the inspector. "You left?" "Yes." "Without speaking to anyone?" "Yes." Another pause. Another answer. Another lie. Not a large lie. Not a convincing lie. Simply a lie. The interview ended shortly afterward. As Richard departed, Inspector Hargreaves looked toward Miss Marple. "He isn't telling us everything." "No." "You seem remarkably calm." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I've been expecting that." The afternoon produced an even more startling development. Harold Ashcombe finally admitted meeting Celia at the cottage. His confession came after nearly an hour of questioning, and once it began, it poured out of him, like water released from a broken dam. "She knew everything." His voice sounded hollow. "Martin told her." The old man stared at the floor. "She wanted answers." "And did you answer her?" asked the inspector. "Yes." The response carried deep sorrow. "We spoke for nearly 2 hours." The timeline immediately shifted. 2 hours, longer than previously believed. "What happened afterward?" Harold closed his eyes. "She left." The inspector leaned forward. "Alone?" A long pause followed. Too long. Then, "Yes." Miss Marple knew immediately that this answer was false. Not entirely false, partially false. The most dangerous kind, because Harold genuinely wished it were true. Yet something else had occurred, something he could not bring himself to discuss. After the interview concluded, Miss Marple requested a private conversation with Harold. The old man agreed. They sat together in the conservatory. Late sunlight filtered through the glass. For several moments neither spoke. Then Miss Marple said gently, "You weren't the last person to see her." Harold's face tightened. "There. Confirmation. You know who was." The old man looked suddenly older than ever. "I made a terrible mistake." Miss Marple remained silent. Eventually he continued. "When she left the cottage," his voice faltered, "someone was waiting." The words settled heavily between them. "Who?" Harold shook his head. "I didn't see clearly." For the first time, Miss Marple believed he was telling the truth. "I only saw a figure." "A man?" "Yes." Another silence. Then Harold whispered, "I thought it was Richard." Interesting. Very interesting. Because Richard claimed he left. Harold believed Richard remained. Yet neither account felt entirely reliable. The pieces still refused to align perfectly. That evening, Miss Marple reviewed everything once more. Richard follows Celia. Harold meets Celia. A mysterious figure appears afterward. Martin Hale dies the following day. Something remained hidden. Something everyone involved continued avoiding. Then another memory surfaced. Not a clue. An observation. One from the very first day. Richard's reaction when Martin Hale's body was discovered. Not grief, not fear, recognition. At the time, it meant nothing. Now it meant everything. Because recognition implied familiarity, and familiarity implied a relationship. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair. At last, a new possibility emerged, one nobody had seriously considered. What if Martin Hale was not merely an investigator? What if he was connected personally? Connected not to Celia, connected to Richard? The idea seemed improbable, yet not impossible, and it explained several otherwise puzzling details. Later that night, Inspector Hargreaves received a telegram from London. The message concerned Martin Hale's background, specifically his surviving relatives. The inspector read the document once, then again. His eyes widened. Immediately, he sent for Miss Marple. When she arrived, he handed her the telegram. She read it carefully, then nodded. Not surprised, merely confirmed. The message contained only a few lines. Yet they changed the entire investigation. Because Martin Hale had a younger sister, and her married name was Fenton. Martin Hale was Richard Fenton's uncle. For several moments neither spoke. The connection altered everything. Richard knew Martin, Martin knew Richard. Both had concealed the relationship, and suddenly every assumption made during the investigation became questionable. Outside, darkness settled over Rosewood Village. The truth was now astonishingly close. Close enough to touch, close enough to frighten. Because if Richard had lied about Martin, what else had he lied about? Miss Marple stared through the window into the darkness. The final pieces were beginning to align. Not perfectly, not yet, but enough. Enough to glimpse the shape of the answer. And the answer pointed towards someone whose carefully maintained composure was beginning to crack. Someone who had spent days guiding suspicion elsewhere. Someone who believed the truth remained hidden. They were wrong. Because Miss Marple now understood something nobody else had recognized. Martin Hale's murder had never been about the past. It had been about the future. And once she proved that, the killer would have nowhere left to hide. Chapter 13. Miss Marple Sets the Trap. Miss Marple slept very little that night. Not because she was troubled, because she was thinking. There is a moment in every investigation when the facts cease appearing as isolated fragments and begin arranging themselves into a coherent picture. The moment rarely arrives dramatically. No lightning flash, No sudden revelation, simply a gradual realization that one already possesses the answer. By dawn, Miss Marple believed she understood almost everything. Almost. One question still required confirmation. Without it, the entire solution remained vulnerable. And Miss Marple disliked vulnerable solutions. She preferred certainty. The following morning, Inspector Hargreaves found her unusually determined. "You've worked something out." It was not a question. Miss Marple smiled. "Most of it." The inspector leaned forward eagerly. "Then tell me." "Not yet." His expression darkened immediately. "Miss Marple, the murderer is frightened." "Good." "No." The elderly lady shook her head. "Frightened people behave unpredictably." The inspector reluctantly acknowledged the point. "What do you need?" "One more reaction." The answer irritated him. Unfortunately, it also sounded exactly like Miss Marple. One reaction, one observation, one final confirmation. That was often how she solved murders. The method seemed absurd, yet it worked. By mid-morning, she requested a gathering at Hawthorne Hall. The excuse appeared innocent. A discussion regarding newly recovered evidence. Everyone connected to the case was invited. Harold Ashcombe, Margaret Ashcombe, Richard Fenton, Dr. Malcolm Reeves, several servants, Inspector Hargreaves himself. The announcement generated immediate interest. By afternoon, the library contained a tense collection of anxious faces. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, silence lingered. Miss Marple sat quietly near the fireplace. For several moments she said nothing, allowing anticipation to grow. Finally she spoke. "Inspector Hargreaves recently received new information from London." That was true. Several heads turned. Richard Fenton remained perfectly still. Too still, Miss Marple noticed. "So did I," she continued. "During my own inquiries." Now she had everyone's attention. The room felt charged. Not dramatically, subtly, like a wire carrying current. Miss Marple folded her hands. Martin Hale came to Rosewood because of Celia's adoption. No one objected. That much was established. He discovered the truth about her mother. Again, agreement. And eventually he discovered the identity of her father. Harold Ashcombe lowered his eyes. Margaret Ashcombe looked away. The old wounds remained painful. Miss Marple continued gently. Martin believed revealing the truth would heal old mistakes. The room remained silent. He was wrong. Now several people looked puzzled. Miss Marple's gaze moved slowly around the room, studying faces, expressions, reactions. The truth created a crisis. Inspector Hargreaves remained quiet. He had learned not to interrupt when Miss Marple reached this stage. The crisis was not Harold Ashcombe. Harold looked up, surprised. The crisis was not Celia. Another pause. And it was not Dr. Reeves. Malcolm Reeves exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly. Yet Miss Marple noticed. The room grew increasingly tense. Then she spoke the words she had been preparing for hours. The crisis was Richard Fenton. The silence that followed seemed to consume the room. Every eye turned toward him. Richard did not move. For several seconds, his face revealed nothing. Then the smallest change appeared. Not panic. Recognition. The recognition of a man hearing his private fears spoken aloud. Inspector Hargreaves leaned forward. "Go on." Miss Marple nodded. At first, Richard appeared uninvolved. She looked toward him. "Then we discovered Martin Hale was your uncle." Richard said nothing. "We also discovered you concealed that relationship." Still silence. Miss Marple continued. "That fact bothered me enormously." She stood slowly. "The relationship served no innocent purpose." Richard's jaw tightened. Across the room, Margaret Ashcombe looked confused. Harold looked increasingly troubled. Miss Marple walked toward a nearby table. The mystery began to change shape. Her voice remained calm, gentle. almost conversational. As I examined Martin Hale's papers, I realized something. She paused. He wasn't investigating the past merely out of curiosity. Inspector Hargreaves nodded. We know that. Yes. Miss Marple smiled faintly. But why continue? No one answered. Because he discovered something far more important. The room felt absolutely still. Then she delivered the crucial point. He discovered Richard already knew the truth. Richard's composure finally cracked. Only slightly. Enough. Miss Marple saw it. Inspector Hargreaves saw it. And suddenly everything became clearer. The elderly lady continued. You knew Martin was coming. Silence. You knew what he had discovered. More silence. You knew Celia would eventually learn the truth. Richard looked toward the window. Rain streaked the glass. For a moment, he seemed very tired, very human, very trapped. Miss Marple pressed forward. Celia discovering Harold was her father did not threaten your marriage. She allowed the words to settle. It threatened something else. Richard closed his eyes briefly. There, confirmation. Miss Marple felt it immediately. The final missing piece. The inheritance. Several people gasped softly. Harold Ashcombe stared. Margaret looked stunned. The words seemed to transform the room. Because suddenly the motive appeared. Simple, terrible, human. Miss Marple continued quietly. Richard believed he would eventually control the Ashcombe estate through marriage. No one interrupted. Then Martin Hale arrived. The pieces aligned. Martin revealed that Celia was Harold's biological daughter. Harold's face paled. The realization reached him. If that truth became public, Miss Marple's voice softened. Legal arrangements regarding the estate would change dramatically. Richard finally spoke. His voice sounded hollow. You don't know that. Miss Marple turned toward him. No. The honesty surprised everyone. I don't. Then she added, but you believed it. The words struck harder than accusation. Because they were true. Richard's silence confirmed it. Miss Marple continued, you panicked. The room seemed to shrink. You followed Celia to Briarwood Cottage. Richard looked downward. You overheard enough to understand what Martin had uncovered. Still no denial. Then you confronted Martin the following day. Inspector Hargreaves spoke quietly. At the river. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. The inspector's eyes narrowed. The pieces were finally fitting. Richard met Martin. An argument followed. A struggle. No elaborate plan. No long conspiracy. Fear. Anger. Desperation. Human weaknesses. The most common ingredients of murder. Richard finally laughed. A short, bitter sound. That's clever. Nobody responded. Very clever. His gaze settled upon Miss Marple. But you can't prove it. The room became silent once more. For a moment, the challenge seemed valid. Then Miss Marple smiled. A very small smile. I already have. Richard's expression changed instantly. For the first time, genuine alarm appeared. The elderly lady continued, the missing page. His eyes flickered. There never was a missing page naming the meeting place. The room fell silent. Inspector Hargreaves stared. What? Miss Marple looked toward him. I invented it. Several people blinked. Richard's face lost colour. Just slightly. Enough. There was no page. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. No document. No one moved. I merely mentioned it yesterday. The realization spread slowly. Then all at once, Richard had reacted. Not verbally, behaviourally. He had attempted to retrieve evidence that did not exist. Because he believed it existed. Because only the murderer feared what it contained. The trap had worked. Perfectly. Richard stared at her. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then something inside him finally collapsed. The fight left his eyes. The tension left his shoulders. And when he spoke again, the words sounded exhausted. I never meant to kill him. The confession landed softly. yet it seemed to echo throughout the room. Margaret Ashcombe covered her mouth. Harold closed his eyes. Inspector Hargreaves remained motionless. Richard stared at the floor. We argued. His voice shook. He wouldn't stop. The words emerged slowly now, like water through a broken dam. He said everything would come out. Another pause. I told him to leave. Silence. He laughed. Richard swallowed. We struggled. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. He hit his head. No one spoke. He fell. Another silence. Then I panicked. The oldest confession in the world. Not premeditated murder. Not careful planning. Fear. Followed by terrible decisions. Richard looked utterly broken. I put him in the water. The room remained still. No one doubted him now. The truth had finally arrived. Not dramatically, not heroically, simply and sadly, exactly as Miss Marple expected. Yet one mystery remained. One final question. Inspector Hargreaves asked it. Where is Celia? Richard looked up. Genuine confusion crossed his face. Then something else. Relief. A strange relief. I don't know. Miss Marple believed him. Immediately. Completely. Richard killed Martin. But he did not know what became of Celia, which meant the missing bride mystery was not yet over. And somewhere beyond Rosewood Village, the woman at the centre of everything was still alive. Miss Marple was now certain of it, because at last she understood the final deception. Celia Ashcombe had never vanished. She had left, deliberately, and very soon she would return. Not as the confused bride everyone remembered, but as a woman who finally knew the truth about herself. And when she did, the final chapter of the mystery would begin. Chapter 14. The Return of the Bride. The rain had stopped by morning. Sunlight spread across Rosewood Village for the first time in several days, illuminating cottages, gardens, and church spires, as though attempting to restore normality. The arrest of Richard Fenton had shaken the village profoundly. Many found it difficult to reconcile the charming groom they believed they knew with the frightened man who had confessed to causing Martin Hale's death and concealing the body. Yet Miss Marple was not surprised. Human beings rarely fit neatly into categories. A person could be kind and selfish, honest and deceptive, loving and dangerous. The most troubling truths were often the most ordinary. Still, one mystery remained unresolved, the central mystery, the disappearance of Celia Ashcombe. And despite Richard's confession, Miss Marple felt oddly peaceful. For the first time since the wedding day, she believed Celia was alive. Inspector Hargreaves shared neither her confidence nor her serenity. He spent most of Friday morning reviewing every remaining lead. There were not many. The Briarwood cottage, the secret meeting, Celia's letter, the taxi driver's testimony. Beyond that, the trail simply ended. It was as though she had stepped beyond the edge of the map. At 11 o'clock, a telephone call changed everything. The call originated from a boarding house in Bath. The proprietor had recently seen newspaper coverage concerning the Rosewood case. One of her guests resembled the missing bride, remarkably so. Within an hour, Inspector Hargreaves was making arrangements. By late afternoon, confirmation arrived. The guest was indeed Celia Ashcombe, alive, safe, and entirely unaware of the latest developments. The news spread through Rosewood with astonishing speed. Church bells did not ring. No official announcement was made. Yet somehow the entire village seemed to know within minutes. People emerged from shops. Neighbours crossed roads. Conversations erupted everywhere. The missing bride had been found. The following day, Celia returned. Miss Marple happened to be standing near the entrance of Hawthorne Hall when the car arrived. The young woman stepped out slowly. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Margaret Ashcombe hurried forward. Mother and daughter embraced. Years of hidden truths seemed to dissolve instantly. Harold Ashcombe stood nearby. Tears glistened openly in his eyes. No one pretended not to notice. Miss Marple quietly looked away. Some reunions deserved privacy. Later that afternoon, after the emotional welcomes had subsided, Celia met with Inspector Hargreaves, Miss Marple, and her parents in the library. The atmosphere remained subdued, not uncomfortable, simply fragile. There had been too many revelations, too much pain, too many years of silence. The inspector began gently. "Miss Ashcombe, can you tell us what happened after your meeting at Briarwood Cottage?" Celia nodded. For several moments she gathered her thoughts. Then she began. "I met Harold." She glanced toward him. The use of his first name seemed strange, then understandable. She was still adjusting to the truth. "We talked for hours." Harold lowered his eyes. "He told me everything." Her voice remained steady. About Evelyn Ward. About the adoption. About the years of secrecy. About the reasons he believed he was protecting her. I was angry. No one blamed her. And hurt. Again, no surprise. But mostly I felt confused. Miss Marple listened carefully. Confusion often motivated people far more powerfully than anger. I needed time. Celia folded her hands. I couldn't face the wedding. A painful silence followed. I couldn't face anyone. The explanation made perfect sense. After learning such life-altering truths, the prospect of walking into a church and pretending nothing had changed must have seemed impossible. "What happened next?" asked the inspector. "I left." "Where?" "London at first, then Bath, then several other places. Always alone, always thinking." The inspector frowned slightly. "You never contacted your family." Celia's expression softened. "I intended to." She glanced toward her parents. "I just didn't know what to say." No one argued with that. Some truths defied immediate conversation. Eventually, Miss Marple asked the question that truly mattered. "Did you ever see Martin Hale after your meeting with Harold?" The room became very still. Celia nodded. Briefly. Everyone focused on her. "He met me the next morning." "Interesting. Very interesting. What did he say?" "He apologized." The answer surprised several people. Not Miss Marple. Martin Hale had always seemed motivated more by conscience than curiosity. "He felt guilty." Celia's voice softened. "He believed he'd destroyed my life." A tragic misunderstanding. Yet an understandable one. And then he left. The timeline aligned perfectly. Only hours later, Martin met Richard and died. The final pieces settled quietly into place. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Inspector Hargreaves closed his notebook. The case was finished, at least officially. The murderer had confessed. The missing bride had returned. The mysteries had been answered. Yet Miss Marple sensed one final truth remained unspoken. Not a criminal truth, a human one. She looked toward Harold Ashcombe. The old man appeared exhausted, relieved, heartbroken, hopeful, all at once. "Celia," he said quietly. The young woman turned toward him. "I'm sorry." The words seemed almost insignificant after 26 years, yet they carried tremendous weight. "I should have told you." Silence followed. The entire room seemed to wait. At last Celia smiled faintly. Not fully, not yet. Healing required time, but it was a beginning. "I know." Harold's eyes filled once again. Miss Marple looked away politely. Some moments belonged only to families. That evening, Rosewood Village slowly returned to itself. The mystery that had dominated every conversation for weeks was over. People resumed discussing gardens, church events, harvest plans, though naturally they continued discussing the case as well. Some habits never changed. Several days later, Miss Marple prepared to leave Rosewood. Her luggage waited by the front door of the cottage where she had been staying. Before departing, she enjoyed one final cup of tea with Inspector Hargreaves. The inspector seemed unusually thoughtful. "What are you thinking?" asked Miss Marple. He smiled. "I was wondering which clue solved it." Miss Marple laughed softly. "There wasn't one." The inspector sighed. "There always isn't. Human beings are rarely solved by clues." She stirred her tea. "They're solved by patterns." The inspector nodded. He had heard the lesson before, yet he suspected he would hear it again. What was the pattern this time? Miss Marple looked out the window, toward the village green, toward ordinary life continuing as it always did. Everyone focused on the secret. The adoption? Yes. She smiled gently. But secrets are not motives. The inspector considered this, then nodded. Slowly, thoughtfully. Richard had not killed to preserve the past. He had killed because he feared the future. The distinction changed everything. As afternoon sunlight spread across Rosewood Village, Miss Marple climbed into the waiting car. The driver closed the door. The engine started, and the village gradually disappeared behind her. Another mystery solved, another reminder of human nature's endless complexity. Love, fear, regret, hope. They had all played their part, as they always did. And somewhere behind the quiet cottages and rose-filled gardens of Rosewood, life continued. A little sadder, perhaps, a little wiser, yet unmistakably human. Miss Marple settled comfortably into her seat. Then, with a faint smile, turned her thoughts toward whatever mystery might be waiting around the next corner.